February 23rd, 1943, 11:47 a.m., 22,000 feet above Wilhelmshaven, Germany. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann's gloved hand tightened around the control stick of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. The oxygen mask pressed cold against his face. Through the armored glass canopy, he watched the contrails first, white scars slashing across the winter sky, each one trailing behind a silver speck that caught the late morning sun. B-17, flying fortresses, dozens of them. His radio crackled. Achtung, Amerikaner. 9 o'clock high. Hoffmann had been briefed about the Americans. Everyone had. For months, the Luftwaffe pilots had shared stories in the ready rooms, passed around intelligence reports over weak coffee and stale cigarettes. The Americans were now coming in daylight. Broad daylight. The audacity of it had sparked debate in every fighter squadron from France to Poland. "They're fools," his squadron commander had said 3 weeks earlier, cigarette dangling from his lips as he studied reconnaissance photographs. Precision bombing in daylight? The RAF learned that lesson in 1940. Blood and fire taught them to fly at night. The Americans will learn the same way. But Hoffmann wasn't so sure anymore. He pushed the stick forward, feeling the Messerschmitt respond instantly, diving toward the bomber formation. The engine roared. His wingman, Feldwebel Ernst Weber, stayed tight on his right, exactly where he should be. They'd flown together for 8 months. Weber was 22 years old and had never seen Berlin. He probably never would. The bomber formation was beautiful in a terrible way. They flew in what the Americans called a combat box, staggered altitudes, overlapping fields of fire, each flying fortress positioned to protect the others. Hoffmann had studied the formation diagrams. On paper, it looked impenetrable. A flying hedgehog bristling with .5 caliber machine guns. But paper never screamed when you shot it. "Break left after the first pass," Hoffmann said into his radio. His breath fogged inside the mask. "Don't stay in the kill zone." The distance closed. 500 meters, 400, 300. The bombers grew from specks to shapes to massive 4-engine machines, each one painted olive drab with White Star insignias on the wings and fuselage. Hoffmann could see the nose art now. Cartoon women, fierce animals, names painted in English he couldn't read. The Americans decorated their machines like they were going to a carnival instead of war. Strange people, these Americans. At 200 meters, the bombers opened fire. The sky exploded into tracer fire, red and white lines that seemed to bend physics as they arced through the air. The sound was like hail on a tin roof, multiplied by 1,000. Hoffmann jinked right, feeling rounds pass close enough to shake his aircraft. One tracer floated past his canopy, moving slower than it should, almost lazy in its trajectory until it wasn't there anymore. He squeezed the trigger. The twin 13mm machine guns and the 20mm cannon mounted in the Messerschmitt's nose erupted. The recoil shuddered through the airframe. He aimed for the lead bomber's number 3 engine, walking his fire across the wing route. Pieces of aluminum peeled away. Smoke trailed. Then he was past, diving below the formation, pulling 6 Gs in the turn. His vision tunneled. The G-suit squeezed his legs. He gasped against the pressure, fighting to stay conscious, and pulled through to the other side. Weber's voice crackled through the radio. "Hit! I got a hit!" Hoffmann rolled level and looked back. One of the fortresses had dropped out of formation, trailing black smoke from 2 engines. It was losing altitude, the pilots fighting to keep the nose up. As Hoffmann watched, 3 parachutes blossomed above the dying bomber. White silk against blue sky. "Form up on me," Hoffmann ordered. "We'll come around for—" The words died in his throat. The damaged B-17 wasn't alone. 2 other fortresses had broken formation and dropped back, flanking the crippled bomber on either side. They were slower now, more vulnerable, but they stayed with their wounded comrade. Their guns tracked outward, creating an envelope of protective fire around the struggling aircraft. Hoffmann had seen German bomber crews do this early in the war during the Battle of Britain, but that was 4 years ago, before the losses mounted, before survival became more important than solidarity. "They're covering the damaged one," Weber said, confusion evident even through the radio static. "Why would they—" "I see it," Hoffmann interrupted. He did see it, and he didn't understand it. The tactical manuals were clear. A damaged aircraft slows the formation, compromises the defense, draws fighters like blood draws sharks. The logical response was to maintain speed, hold formation integrity, and complete the mission. The damaged crew would bail out or crash land. That was war. That was reality. But these Americans had broken formation to protect a dying aircraft and its crew. Hoffmann's fuel gauge caught his eye. 20 minutes left, maybe less if he kept fighting. The mathematics of aerial combat were unforgiving. You could win every dogfight and still die when your engine quit at 20,000 feet. "Break off," he told Weber. "We need fuel." They turned east, toward home, leaving the American bombers to continue their run on Wilhelmshaven's U-boat pens. As Hoffmann climbed, he looked back one more time. The three fortresses were still together. 2 healthy, 1 dying, all 3 committed to each other. 45 minutes later, Hoffmann's Messerschmitt touched down at Jever Airfield. The landing gear chirped against concrete. He taxied to the hardstand where the ground crew waited and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was profound after 3 hours of constant noise. His crew chief, a greying veteran named Otto, who'd served on the Western Front in the last war, helped him out of the cockpit. "How many?" Otto asked, offering Hoffmann a cigarette. "None confirmed." Hoffmann accepted the cigarette and let Otto light it. The smoke tasted like failure. "We damaged 1. Maybe 2. They kept coming." "They always do now." Otto glanced toward the western sky, as if he could still see the American formations up there, grinding eastward through flak and fighters. The Americans. They're different from the British, yeah? But he didn't say how. "Different," Hoffmann agreed. He wasn't sure he could explain what he'd seen, what it meant that the Americans would sacrifice tactical advantage for the chance to save their comrades. The Luftwaffe taught efficiency, economy of force, victory through superior skill and technology. The Americans seemed to be teaching something else entirely. In the ready room, Hoffmann found the intelligence officer waiting. Lieutenant Dieter Kohl, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd never flown a combat mission but knew everything about enemy capabilities, tactics, and intentions. Kohl had maps spread across the table, marked with colored pins representing raid paths and target analyses. "Oberleutnant." Kohl looked up. "Your report?" Hoffmann described the engagement in technical terms: altitudes, heading, aircraft types, and ammunition expended. He mentioned the damaged bomber and the 2 escorts that stayed with it. He didn't mention the feeling he'd had watching those 3 aircraft struggle westward together. Kohl made notes. The Americans are learning. They've increased their defensive formations and improved their gunner coordination, but their losses remain significant. The 8th Air Force lost 19 bombers over Wilhelmshaven today. That's 190 crewmen, killed, captured, or missing. Statistically, they cannot sustain this. "They keep coming anyway," Hoffmann said. "For now." Kohl tapped his pencil against the map. "But winter's ending. Soon they'll have fighter escorts that can go deeper into Germany. P-47 Thunderbolts. When that happens, our advantages shrink." Hoffmann studied the map. The pins showed a pattern. American raids growing larger, penetrating deeper, hitting harder. Bremen, Emden, Wilhelmshaven, Vegesack. The names marked a methodical destruction of Germany's industrial capacity, and behind each pin was a story like today's. American crews who kept flying into hell itself, who protected each other when logic demanded abandonment, who believed in something beyond tactical efficiency. What did they believe in? That question haunted Hoffmann through the evening. He ate dinner in the mess hall. Potato soup that was more water than potato, bread that was more sawdust than grain, ersatz coffee that tasted like burned dirt. Around him, the other pilots talked about the day's fighting, their voices carrying the peculiar mix of excitement and exhaustion that came after combat. "I got two," Hauptmann Friedrich Mayer announced, grinning around a mouthful of bread. "Both confirmed. Watch them go down." Someone clapped. Someone else whistled. "The Americans make it easy," Mayer continued. "They fly straight and level, like they're on a training exercise. No evasion, no tactics. Just straight into the flak and straight through the fighters. It's like shooting ducks on a pond. Except ducks don't shoot back with .50 caliber machine guns," Hoffmann thought, "and ducks don't stay in formation to protect the wounded." He finished his soup in silence and walked outside. The February night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky, the same stars the American bomber crews would see as they flew back to England, those who made it back. How many of them were already dead? How many more were bleeding in damaged aircraft, fighting to stay airborne across the North Sea? And why did they keep coming? Hoffmann had fought the British in 1940, during the glory days when the Luftwaffe seemed invincible. He'd fought the Russians in 1941, watching the Eastern Front consume entire squadrons like a furnace. He understood the British. They fought for survival, for their island, for the ancient grudges between nations. But the Americans? They'd crossed an ocean to fight a war that wasn't theirs, in skies far from home, in machines that should have been obsolete against German fighters. They took horrific losses. They watched their friends die in burning aircraft. They knew the statistics, knew that completing a 25-mission tour was close to impossible. And they kept coming, day after day, week after week, month after month. In the distance, Hoffmann heard the rumble of aircraft engines, German night fighters scrambling to intercept RAF bombers heading for somewhere deeper in the Reich. The British by night, the Americans by day. No rest, no respite, just an endless grinding pressure that wore down men and machines alike. He thought about the 3 B-17s he'd seen, 2 healthy, 1 dying, all 3 together. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe the Americans believed that no one gets left behind, that the mission mattered less than the men. That victory meant something different when measured against the cost of abandoning your brothers in the sky. If that was true, Hoffmann realized, then the Americans were fighting a different war than he was. They weren't just fighting for territory or ideology or national interest. They were fighting for each other, and that made them dangerous in ways the intelligence briefings never captured. Because how do you defeat an enemy who measures victory by how many of his comrades he brings home? Hoffmann didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure anyone did. But he knew he'd find out. The Americans will be back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until one side broke or the war ended. He crushed his cigarette under his boot heel and went back inside, where the heat and light and voices waited. Tomorrow would bring more American bombers, more desperate fights at 25,000 feet, more questions that had no good answers. Tomorrow would tell him what the Americans really believed, and whether belief was enough to win a war. March 17th, 1943, 2:34 p.m. Crashed B-17 wreckage, 8 kilometers southeast of Oldenburg, Germany. Second Lieutenant James Jimmy Donovan woke up in snow. His face was pressed against something cold and wet. His ears rang, a high-pitched whine that blocked out everything else. He tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through his left shoulder, sharp enough to make him gasp. Gasping was a mistake too. His ribs screamed. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the grey German sky. Snowflakes drifted down, landing on his face, melting against his skin. For a long moment, he couldn't remember where he was or why everything hurt. Then it came back. The mission briefing is at 0600 hours. Vegesack submarine yards. Expected heavy flak. Expected fighter opposition. Expected casualties. His crew, 9 men he'd trained with, flown with, and trusted with his life, climbing into Lady Luck, their B-17F, serial number 42 to 30,177. His co-pilot, Bill Henderson, was making jokes about German beer. The radio operator, Tommy Chen, is showing everyone a letter from his girl back in San Francisco. The fighters had hit them over the target. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs coming in waves, attacking from 12 o'clock high and 6 o'clock low. The sky had turned into a maze of tracer fire and exploding flak. Jimmy had held the yoke steady while Henderson called out bandits, and the bombardier, Mickey Reardon, lined up the shot. "Bombs away!" Then the second wave hit them. A 20mm cannon shell punched through the cockpit, right between Jimmy and Henderson. The explosion filled the world with noise and fire and broken glass. Henderson slumped forward, blood on his face. The controls went mushy. The number 2 engine was burning. Jimmy had fought to keep Lady Luck airborne, but physics and fire don't negotiate. The aircraft rolled left, nose dropping, altitude bleeding away in a spiral that became a dive, that became a crash, that became snow, cold, pain, silence. Jimmy tried to sit up. His left arm wouldn't work properly. Dislocated shoulder probably. Or a broken collarbone. He used his right arm to push himself upright and immediately wished he hadn't. The world tilted. His vision sparkled at the edges. Breathe. Just breathe. When the spinning stopped, he looked around. He was sitting in a snowy field, about 30 yards from a smoking crater where Lady Luck had ended her last flight. Pieces of aluminum and steel were scattered across a 100-yard radius. A wing section here, a torn-off landing gear there, and a twisted propeller blade embedded in the frozen ground like a gravestone. No other parachutes. No other survivors that he could see. His crew, his brothers. Oh God. Jimmy tried to stand. His legs shook but held. He took 2 steps toward the wreckage, then stopped. The heat from the burning fuel was intense even at this distance. Black smoke poured into the grey sky. If anyone was still inside that inferno. He couldn't finish the thought. Movement caught his eye. A truck is coming across the field. Wehrmacht green, moving fast, snow spraying from its tires. Behind it, 2 more vehicles, German soldiers. Jimmy's training kicked in. Name, rank, serial number. That's all they get. Name, rank, serial number. He stood as straight as his broken body would allow and waited. The first truck skidded to a stop 20 feet away. 6 soldiers jumped out, rifles ready, shouting in German. Jimmy raised his right hand. His left wouldn't lift higher than his waist. He didn't speak German, but their intent was clear enough. "Second Lieutenant James Donovan," he said, voice steady despite everything. "United States Army Air Forces. Serial number 0 to 734,829. One of the soldiers, an older man with a sergeant's insignia, approached carefully. He kept his rifle pointed at Jimmy's chest, but his trigger finger was outside the guard. Professional, not scared, not angry, just doing his job. The sergeant said something in German. Jimmy shook his head. "I don't understand. Second Lieutenant James Donovan, United States Army Air Forces, serial number." The sergeant held up a hand, stopping him. He turned to the other soldiers and barked orders. 2 of them moved toward the burning wreckage. The others formed a loose perimeter, watching the tree line for other survivors. The sergeant turned back to Jimmy and pointed at his shoulder, then made a gesture that clearly meant hurt. Jimmy nodded. "Yeah, shoulder's bad." The sergeant called over his shoulder. A younger soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, trotted over with a medical bag. He approached Jimmy cautiously, like approaching a wounded animal, and carefully touched his shoulder. Jimmy hissed through his teeth. The young soldier said something to the sergeant. The sergeant nodded and gestured for Jimmy to sit down. When Jimmy hesitated, the sergeant pointed more forcefully at the ground. Jimmy sat. The young medic worked quickly and efficiently, cutting away Jimmy's flight jacket to examine the shoulder. He said something that might have been an apology before he grabbed Jimmy's arm and yanked. The shoulder joint popped back into place with a sensation that made Jimmy's vision go white. He didn't scream, refused to scream, but a groan escaped through clenched teeth. When his vision cleared, the medic was wrapping his arm and shoulder in a makeshift sling. "Danke," Jimmy managed. "Thank you." The medic nodded and moved away. The sergeant offered Jimmy a canteen, water. Jimmy drank, not realizing how thirsty he was until the cool liquid hit his throat. He drank half the canteen before the sergeant pulled it away. They waited in silence, captor and captive, watching the smoke rise from Lady Luck's grave. The two soldiers returned from the wreckage, shaking their heads. No survivors. Nobody could recover from that hell. Jimmy closed his eyes. Bill Henderson, Mickey Reardon, Tommy Chen, all of them, gone. The sergeant's voice interrupted his grief. "Come." Jimmy opened his eyes. The sergeant was gesturing toward the truck. Time to go. It was time to become a prisoner of war, to trade the sky for a cell, to wait out the rest of the war behind barbed wire while other crews flew missions he'd never complete. He stood and walked to the truck. The soldiers helped him climb into the back, not roughly, just efficiently. They weren't celebrating or jeering. They weren't treating him like an enemy to be humiliated. They were just soldiers doing their duty, handling a routine task that happened dozens of times a day across occupied Europe. The truck lurched forward, heading east toward Oldenburg. Jimmy sat on the bench, guarded by two soldiers who kept their rifles ready but not aggressive. Through the canvas flap at the back, he watched the German countryside roll past, snow-covered fields, bare trees, and occasional farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys. Peaceful, almost beautiful. Nothing like the war he'd been fighting at 20,000 feet. After 20 minutes, they reached Oldenburg. The truck wound through streets that looked like they'd been lifted from a storybook. Medieval architecture, narrow lanes, and a church spire rising above peaked roofs. People stopped to watch the truck pass. Some stared with curiosity, others with hatred. A few with something that might have been pity. The truck stopped outside a grey stone building with Wehrmacht flags hanging limply in the cold air. Headquarters. Interrogation. Processing. The soldiers helped Jimmy down. They walked him through a heavy wooden door, down a corridor that smelled of cigarettes and coffee, and into a small room with a table, 3 chairs, and a single window looking out onto a courtyard. "Sitzen," one soldier said, pointing at a chair. Jimmy sat. They left him alone, locking the door behind them. He waited. Time moved strangely in the room. Could have been 20 minutes. Could have been 2 hours. Jimmy studied the walls. Bare plaster, no decorations, and a water stain in the corner that looked like a map of Italy. His shoulder throbbed. His ribs ached with each breath. But the worst pain was in his chest, where his heart kept trying to understand that his crew was gone. 9 men, 9 lives. And he was the only one who'd made it. The door opened. A Luftwaffe officer walked in, tall, lean, in his mid-30s, wearing a perfectly pressed uniform with an iron cross at his collar. He carried a folder and a pack of cigarettes. His eyes were blue and tired and intelligent. "Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann," the officer said in English. "Please remain sitting." He sat across from Jimmy, opened the folder, and studied it for a moment. Then he looked up. "Second Lieutenant James Donovan, from Chicago. Pilot, 303rd Bombardment Group, 359th Bombardment Squadron. You arrived in England in December 1942. This was your 13th mission." Hoffman paused. "Unlucky number 13. Perhaps you should have stayed home." "Name, rank, serial number. That's all they get." "Second Lieutenant James Donovan, United States Army Air Forces, serial number 0 to 734,829. Hoffman smiled slightly. "Yes, I know. The Geneva Convention. Very proper." He offered the pack of cigarettes across the table. "Please. Real tobacco. Not the ersatz garbage we give the enlisted men." Jimmy hesitated, then took one. His hands were shaking. Hoffman lit it for him with a silver lighter, then lit his own. They smoked in silence for a moment. "I am not here to interrogate you," Hoffman said finally. The intelligence officers will do that later, and you will give them your name, rank, and serial number until they grow bored and send you to a prison camp. This is standard. Expected. He tapped ash into a tray. I am here because I have questions of a different nature. Jimmy said nothing. I shot at your formation today, Hoffmann continued. Perhaps I even shot at your aircraft specifically. In the confusion of combat, who can say? But I watched what happened after. I watched how your squadron responded when aircraft were damaged. I watched the formation adjust, the healthy bombers protecting the wounded ones. He leaned forward slightly. Why do you do this? Why do American crews break formation to protect damaged aircraft? It makes no tactical sense. It increases casualties. It decreases mission effectiveness. Jimmy met his eyes. You wouldn't understand. Try me. We don't leave our people behind, ever. That's not complicated. Hoffmann considered this. But you do leave them behind. Your damaged aircraft crashes. Your crews die or become prisoners. The protection you offer is mostly symbolic. You cannot prevent the inevitable, only delay it. Yet you sacrifice tactical advantage for this symbolism. He paused. In the Luftwaffe, we prioritize mission success. A damaged aircraft is already lost. Why lose more trying to save what cannot be saved? Jimmy took a long drag on the cigarette. The smoke burned going down, but it was better than German prison camp tobacco would be. Because, he said slowly, they're not already lost until they're actually lost. And even if we can't save the plane, maybe we save the crew. Maybe we buy them time to bail out over friendly territory instead of here. Maybe we give them a fighting chance. He looked at Hoffmann. And maybe it's not about tactics. Maybe it's about being the kind of men who don't give up on each other. Hoffmann was quiet for a long moment. He studied Jimmy with those tired blue eyes, as if trying to solve an equation that had too many variables. You Americans, he finally said, fight a very expensive war.
Yeah, Jimmy agreed. We do. And you believe it is worth the cost? Even when the cost is your entire crew? Even when the cost is your freedom? Jimmy thought about Bill Henderson cracking jokes in the cockpit. Tommy Chen is showing everyone his girl's picture. Mickey Reardon's terrible singing voice. 9 men who'd become brothers, who trusted each other with their lives, who died together in a burning aircraft over foreign soil. I believe, Jimmy said quietly, that some things matter more than winning efficiently. Like making sure that when someone looks up at those bombers, they see men who take care of each other, who fight for each other, who doesn't abandon their brothers just because the math says it's smarter. He met Hoffmann's eyes again. That's what we're fighting for, not just to beat you, to prove that kind of world still exists. Hoffmann stubbed out his cigarette. You are either very brave or very foolish, he said. I have not decided which. Maybe both. A knock at the door interrupted them. A soldier entered and said something in German. Hoffmann nodded and stood. The intelligence officers are ready for you now, he told Jimmy. You will give them your name, rank, and serial number. They will threaten and cajole and promise cigarettes. You will continue to give them your name, rank, and serial number. Eventually, they will send you to Stalag Luft 3. That is where we keep captured airmen. The conditions are tolerable. You will survive the war, probably, if you're lucky. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back. Your crew, Hoffmann said. The ones who died today. What were their names? Jimmy told him. All 9 names. Hoffmann listened, nodded once, and left without another word. Jimmy sat alone in the room, finishing his cigarette, thinking about brothers who died in fire, and brothers who were still flying somewhere over Germany, still fighting, still refusing to leave anyone behind. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, why they kept coming back. Day after day, mission after mission, loss after loss. Because some things mattered more than tactics. Some things mattered more than survival. Some things were worth dying for. April 8th, 1943, 27,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. Major Karl Baumer
had been flying fighters for the Luftwaffe since 1939. He'd fought over Poland, France, England and Russia. He'd shot down 32 enemy aircraft, confirmed kills, witnessed and verified. His Knight's Cross hung at his throat, the silver cross and ribbon marking him as one of Germany's elite. He knew what he was doing. He'd survived 4 years of war through skill, instinct, and a cold understanding of aerial combat's brutal mathematics. But watching the American bomber stream approach Bremen, Balmer felt something he hadn't felt since 1940. Doubt. Achtung. Formation at 2 o'clock. Altitude 8,000 meters. The call came from Lieutenant Werner Schroer, flying wing position. Balmer glanced right and saw them. Over 100 B-17s and B-24 Liberators, their contrails drawing white lines across the blue April sky. The formations were stacked in layers, offset for mutual protection, each bomber bristling with machine guns. A flying fortress indeed. All aircraft, this is Adler Leader, Balmer transmitted. Attack from 12 o'clock high. Dive through and engage from below. Don't follow them down. One pass and break away. Understood? A chorus of acknowledgements crackled back. Balmer pushed his throttle forward. His Focke-Wulf 190A5 surged ahead, climbing through thin air toward the intercept point. Behind him, 11 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 11 followed in tactical formation. Good pilots, veterans, mostly. Men who understood that surviving was as important as killing. The American formation grew larger. Balmer could make out individual aircraft now, their olive-drab paint, their nose art, their gun turrets tracking outward. He'd studied the defensive capabilities. 13.5 caliber machine guns per B-17, overlapping fields of fire. A well-coordinated bomber box could put up a wall of lead that would tear a fighter apart. The key was speed and angle. Come in fast, shoot fast, get out fast. Beginning attack run, Balmer transmitted, now. He rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive, building speed and positioning for a head-on pass. The bombers rushed up to meet him. At 600 meters, they opened fire. The sky filled with tracer rounds, thousands of them, creating a cone of death that Balmer had to fly through to reach his target. He picked a B-17 in the lead element, aimed for the cockpit, and squeezed the trigger. His 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns erupted. The recoil vibrated through the airframe. He saw his rounds walk across the bomber's nose, saw glass shatter, and saw pieces of aluminum peel away. Then he was past, diving beneath the formation, pulling 5 Gs in the brake turn. Behind him, the bomber he'd hit staggered. Smoke poured from the cockpit. The aircraft began a slow roll to the left. Hit on the leader. Schroer's voice, excited. But Balmer was already looking for threats. A Focke-Wulf flashed past, trailing fire, hit by return fire from the bombers. The pilot bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the blue. That was Feldwebel Gruber, 23 years old, engaged to a girl in Munich. One down. Ours. The formation didn't break. The damaged bomber fell away, but the others closed ranks, filling the gap. The bomb run continued. The mission continued. They always continued. Balmer climbed for another pass. His wingman, Oberfeldwebel Hans Richter, stayed with him. A good man, steady hands, 46 kills to his name. Together they positioned for an attack from 6 o'clock, coming up from behind and below where the defensive fire was theoretically weakest. Theoretically. At 400 meters, the ball turret gunners spotted them. Twin .50 calibers swung toward Balmer's aircraft. He jinked right, then left, making himself a difficult target. Richter fired first, his rounds stitching across a bomber's tail section. The B-17 shuddered, but kept flying. Balmer lined up on a different target, a Liberator flying in the trailing element. He walked his fire from the tail toward the wing route, aiming for the fuel tanks. His rounds impacted. Sparks. Smoke. Then fire. The B-24's right wing erupted in flames. The bomber snap-rolled and began to spin, falling out of formation. Bomber counted parachutes as he broke away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 men who would survive. 5 men who would become prisoners. 5 men who would live to see the end of this war, whatever that end looked like. Good kill, Richter transmitted. That's 33 for you, Herr Major. Balmer didn't respond. He was watching the formation. The formations adjusted. Despite the 2 bombers lost, despite the fighters harassing them from every angle, despite the fact that they were deep in German territory with no fighter escort, the Americans kept coming. The gaps closed. The bomb bay doors opened. They were going to hit Bremen, no matter what. Adler Squadron, reform at 7,000 meters, Balmer ordered. Prepare for another pass after they drop. But even as he gave the order, he knew it wouldn't matter. The Americans would drop their bombs, turn for home, and keep flying. Some would make it, many wouldn't, and tomorrow more would come, and the day after, and the day after. An endless stream of bombers, flowing over Germany like a river that never ran dry. The flak batteries opened up as the bombers approached the city. Black puffs of smoke bloomed across the sky, 88mm shells exploding at altitude, each burst sending shrapnel in every direction. Balmer watched a B-17 take a direct hit. The bomber simply disintegrated. No fire, no spin, just an explosion that left nothing but falling debris. 10 men, gone in an instant. The bombs fell. Even from 8,000 meters, Balmer could see them. Small black shapes tumbling from the bomb bays, arcing downward toward Bremen's industrial district, toward the shipyards and submarine pens, toward the factories and rail yards, toward people. Balmer had grown up in Bremen. His parents still lived there, in a house near the Weser River. His sister taught school 3 blocks from the city centre. He'd walked those streets as a boy, bought sweets from the corner shop, played football with friends who were now soldiers or dead. And now American bombs were falling on those streets. This was war. He understood that. Bremen built submarines. Those submarines sank Allied ships. This was legitimate military action, sanctioned by the rules of war, justified by military necessity. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different things. The bombers completed their run and turned west, heading for the North Sea and England beyond. Balmer's squadron made 2 more passes, shooting down 1 more B-17 and damaging several others. The Americans fought back viciously. 1 burst of point-caliber fire punched through Balmer's left wing, leaving holes the size of dinner plates. His aircraft shook but kept flying. Focke-Wulf engineering. Solid, reliable. By the time his fuel gauge hit the critical mark, the American formation was limping toward the coast. Balmer counted at least 8 bombers trailing smoke or showing visible damage. 2 more were losing altitude, their crews fighting to stay airborne long enough to reach the North Sea. All aircraft, break off and return to base, Balmer transmitted. Good work today. The flight back to Jeva was quiet. Balmer checked his wingman. Richter was fine, his aircraft undamaged. Behind them, the rest of the squadron straggled home in loose formation. 11 fighters had started the mission. 10 were returning. Feldwebel Gruber wouldn't be having dinner tonight. They landed as the sun was setting, painting the western sky orange and red. Balmer taxied to his hard stand, shut down the engine, and sat in the cockpit for a moment. The silence after combat always felt strange, like stepping from chaos into a void. His crew chief appeared at the wing. Herr Major, are you injured? No. Balmer unstrapped and climbed down. His legs were stiff. 4 hours in the cockpit would do that. How does she look?
The crew chief walked around the Focke-Wulf, assessing damage. Nothing critical. We can patch the wing and have her ready by morning. He paused. You got another kill today? Congratulations, Herr Major. Yes. That's 33. Baumann nodded absently.
33 enemy aircraft destroyed. 33 victories. 33 times he'd sent men falling from the sky in fire and terror. The number should have meant something. Pride. Accomplishment. Proof of skill. Instead, it just felt heavy. He walked to the operations building, where Cole was already compiling reports. The intelligence officer looked up as Balmer entered. Major, initial assessment shows good results. We count 12 bombers destroyed or severely damaged over Bremen. The flak batteries claim 7 additional kills. 19 aircraft total, with perhaps 200 American casualties. 200 men, dead, wounded, or captured. And our losses? Balmer asked. 1 pilot lost, Gruber. 3 aircraft damaged but repairable. Light casualties, considering the engagement intensity. Light casualties, 1 dead pilot and 3 damaged aircraft, against 19 bombers destroyed. The mathematics look good. By any tactical measure, today was a victory. So why did it feel like a defeat? They hit the submarine pens, Balmer said quietly. Cole consulted his notes. Yes, preliminary reports indicate significant damage to U-boat facilities and shipyard infrastructure. The Americans are getting better at precision targeting. Their Norden bomb sites allow... I know what their bomb sites allow. Balmer cut him off. I know what they're capable of. What I don't know is how we stop them. Cole blinked. Herr Major? We shot down 19 bombers today. 19. Do you know how many they sent? 115. So we got 16% of the force. That means 84% of their bombers hit Bremen and returned to England. Balmer pulled off his gloves. Tomorrow they'll send 120 or 130. They'll replace the losses faster than we can inflict them. We're developing new tactics, Cole said. New weapons. The rocket-equipped fighters are showing promise and... It won't matter. Balmer's voice was flat. They have more aircraft than we have ammunition, more crews than we have fuel, more industrial capacity than we can possibly destroy. We're trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Cole looked uncomfortable. Herr Major, such defeatist talk. I'm not being defeatist. I'm being realistic. Balmer sat down heavily. I've been flying against the Americans for 4 months now. Do you know what I've learned? They don't care about losses. They don't care about tactics. They just keep coming, every day, no matter what we do to them. He thought about the formations he'd attacked today, the way they'd closed ranks after losing aircraft, the way damaged bombers stayed in formation as long as possible, the way healthy crews position themselves to protect wounded ones. They fight differently than we do, Balmer continued. We fight for territory, for ideology, for victory. The Americans fight for each other. Every mission, every bomber, every crew, they act like they're responsible for bringing everyone home, and that makes them, he searched for the word, relentless. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, with respect, Herr Major, that philosophy is why they take such heavy casualties. Emotion has no place in war. Cold calculation, superior tactics, efficient execution, these win battles. Maybe. Balmer stood. Or maybe we're learning the wrong lessons from this war. He left before Cole could respond. Outside, the evening air was cool and clean. Balmer walked across the airfield, past the fighter revetments, past the fuel trucks and ammunition trailers, toward the officers' quarters. Other pilots were gathering in the mess hall. He could hear their voices, excited recountings of the day's action, debates about which tactics worked best, speculation about tomorrow's operations. Young voices, confident voices, voices that still believed in victory. Balmer kept walking. In his quarters, he had a letter from his mother. She'd written about Bremen, about how the city was changing, about shortages and rationing and fear, about the sound of air raid sirens in the night, about wondering if her son was the one flying overhead, trying to protect them. I pray for you every day, she'd written. I pray you stay safe. I pray this war ends soon. I pray that when it does, you'll still be the boy I remember, the one who believed in honor and duty and protecting what matters. Balmer folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. Honor, duty, protection. He'd believed in those things once. In 1939, when the war started, he'd been certain Germany was fighting for something righteous. By 1940, he'd believed in victory. By 1941, he'd believed in survival. Now, in 1943, he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. Except this, the Americans kept coming, and they brought something with them, some quality that transcended tactics and training, something that made them dangerous, not because they were better fighters, but because they refused to stop fighting, refused to abandon each other, refused to let mathematics dictate morality. Balmer had studied the American losses. The statistics were staggering. An 8th Air Force bomber crew had less than a 50% chance of surviving their 25-mission tour. Less than 50%. Those were terrible odds, suicidal odds. And yet they flew anyway. Because leaving brothers behind was worse than dying together. That philosophy should have been a weakness. It violated every principle of efficient warfare. It prioritized emotion over logic, brotherhood over tactics. But watching those formations day after day, seeing them absorb punishments that should have broken them, witnessing their stubborn refusal to leave wounded bombers unprotected, Balmer was beginning to understand that the Americans weren't wrong. They were just fighting a different war. A war where victory meant something beyond territory captured or enemies killed. A war where coming home with your brothers mattered more than coming home victorious. A war where the measure of a man wasn't how many enemy aircraft he shot down, but how many friends he brought back alive. And if that was true, if the Americans really believed that, then Germany was in trouble. Because you couldn't defeat an enemy whose definition of victory had nothing to do with winning. Balmer lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow the Americans would come again. He'd scramble with his squadron. They'd shoot down some bombers. Others would get through. Men would die on both sides. The war would grind forward another day. And through it all, the Americans would keep fighting for each other. Even unto death.
April 15th, 1943. Dulag Luft Interrogation Center, Oberursel, Germany. Captain Robert Dutch Vandermeer sat in a room that was too warm. The heat was deliberate. So was the uncomfortable wooden chair. So was the fact that he'd been sitting here for 3 hours without water, without food, without any acknowledgement that he existed. All of it was designed to break him down, to make him compliant, to prepare him for what came next. Dutch had been trained for this. Every American airman received instruction on what to expect as a prisoner of war. The Dulag Luft Interrogation Center at Oberursel was famous, or infamous, among captured Allied aircrews. This was where they asked questions. This was where the Germans brought you first, before sending you to permanent camps. This was where they tried to make you talk. Dutch checked his watch. They'd let him keep it, surprisingly. 1,620 hours. He'd been shot down 4 days ago over Schweinfurt, his B-17 torn apart by fighter attacks and flak. He'd bailed out at 18,000 feet, landed in a farmer's field, and was captured within 30 minutes by Wehrmacht soldiers who'd been polite, professional, and entirely uninterested in his explanations. The door opened. A Luftwaffe officer entered, middle-aged, wearing the uniform of a major, carrying a thick folder and 2 bottles of beer. He smiled warmly as he sat down across from Dutch. Captain Vandermeer, welcome to Germany, though I imagine you wish you were somewhere else. His English was perfect, barely accented. I am Major Erich Zimmermann. I handle the processing of captured American airmen. May I offer you a beer? It's genuine Bavarian Pilsner, not the watered-down rubbish they serve in England. Dutch said nothing. Zimmermann opened both bottles and pushed one across the table. Please, you must be thirsty. The guards sometimes forget that prisoners are human beings who require refreshment.
He took a sip from his own bottle. Ah, wonderful. We should enjoy these small pleasures while we can, yes? The beer sat on the table between them, condensation beading on the glass. Dutch's throat was dry. The room was hot. The beer would taste like heaven. Name, rank, serial number. Captain Robert Vandermeer, Dutch said. United States Army Air Forces. Serial number 0 to 662,847. Zimmerman nodded as if Dutch had just said something profound. Yes, yes. The Geneva Convention. Very proper. But you misunderstand, Captain. I'm not here to interrogate you about military secrets. I already know everything relevant about your unit, your aircraft, your mission profile. He opened the folder. You fly with the 91st Bombardment Group, 322nd Bombardment Squadron, based at Basingbourn. Your aircraft was B-17F serial number 42 to 29,670, nicknamed Belle of Birmingham, after your navigator's hometown. You were flying deputy-led in the High Squadron on a mission to destroy ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. He looked up, smiling. See? I don't need you to tell me these things. We have excellent intelligence. Dutch kept his face neutral. The information was accurate, all of it publicly available from standard identification procedures. Nothing Zimmerman had said required insider knowledge. What I'm curious about, Zimmerman continued, has nothing to do with military intelligence. I want to understand you Americans. Your thinking. Your philosophy. He leaned forward. For instance, you were flying deputy-led. That means your crew was experienced, trusted. How many missions had you completed? Silence. Let me guess. 15? 18? More than halfway through your tour, certainly, or they wouldn't have given you a lead position. You were so close to going home, Captain. So close to surviving this war. And yet you volunteered to fly a mission deep into Germany, into some of the heaviest fighter and flak concentrations we have. Aye. Because those ball-bearing factories kept German fighters in the air. Because destroying them might save other American crews. Because the mission mattered more than personal safety. But Dutch didn't say any of that. Zimmerman sighed and sat back. You won't talk. I understand. The Geneva Convention, honor, duty, all very admirable. So let me tell you a story instead. Perhaps it will help you understand why I'm so curious about American psychology. He lit a cigarette without offering one to Dutch. 3 weeks ago, I interviewed a B-24 pilot, Lieutenant Michael Donnelly from Boston. His bomber was hit over Bremen. The aircraft was on fire, losing altitude rapidly. Standard procedure would be to bail out immediately, yes? Save yourself, while you have the altitude and time to do so safely. Zimmerman paused for a drag on his cigarette. But Lieutenant Donnelly's ball turret gunner was trapped. The hydraulics failed, the turret wouldn't rotate to the exit position, and the gunner couldn't get out. So Lieutenant Donnelly stayed at the controls. He flew that burning aircraft for 6 more minutes. 6 minutes while his crew worked to manually crank the turret into position. 6 minutes while the fire spread. 6 minutes while the altitude dropped from 15,000 feet to 8,000 feet, reducing everyone's chance of survival with each passing second. Dutch felt his jaw tighten. He knew how this story ended. He'd heard dozens like it. They got the gunner out, Zimmerman continued. Donnelly ordered everyone to bail out. Then, and only then, did he leave the aircraft himself. He bailed out at 4,000 feet, barely enough altitude for his parachute to open properly. He broke both legs on landing. Zimmerman tapped his cigarette into an ashtray. Now, here's what I don't understand. Donnelly was the pilot, the commander. His duty was to ensure mission success, and, failing that, to preserve his own life so he could fly again. Instead, he risked everything, including his crew's lives, to save one man who was, tactically speaking, already lost. The turret malfunction meant that gunner was dead. Accepting that and moving on would have been logical, efficient, smart. But he got him out, Dutch said quietly. Yes. Zimmerman looked at him intently. He did,
at tremendous cost and risk. Why? What compels American airmen to make such choices? It's not isolated. We see it constantly. Damaged bombers staying in formation when breaking away would increase their survival chances. Healthy aircraft slowing down to escort wounded ones. Pilots risking everything to save one crew member. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the compound where other captured airmen were being processed. In the Luftwaffe, we are trained to prioritize the mission, the aircraft, the collective good. Individual sacrifice is expected when necessary, but deliberately increasing casualties to save those already doomed? That's not courage. That's wasteful sentimentality. Or maybe, Dutch said, it's the only thing worth fighting for. Zimmerman turned back. Explain. Dutch knew he should stay silent, stick to name, rank, serial number. But something in Zimmerman's question felt genuine, not manipulation, but honest confusion, like a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit his understanding of reality. You said Donnelly risked his crew to save one man, Dutch began slowly, but that's not how we see it. From our perspective, Donnelly proved that his crew was worth risking for, that no one gets left behind, that if any of them got into trouble, their commander would move heaven and earth to bring them home. But the tactical cost. Damn the tactical cost. Dutch's voice was hard now. You want to know why we keep coming back? Why we fly into hell itself day after day? It's because we absolutely know, that our brothers won't abandon us, that if we go down, they'll come for us, that the mission matters, but the men matter more. Zimmerman was quiet for a long moment. That philosophy will cost you the war. Maybe, or maybe it's the only way to win a war worth winning. Philosophical nonsense. War is mathematics, resources, logistics, industrial capacity, tactical efficiency. Emotion has no place in modern warfare. Dutch met his eyes. Then why are you losing? The room went very still.
We are not losing, Zimmerman said carefully. We control most of Europe. Our armies are being bled white in Russia while your cities burn. We're hitting your factories every day. Your submarine fleet is being hunted to extinction. Your fighter pilots are running out of fuel and ammunition. Dutch leaned forward. You've got superior tactics, superior technology, superior training. On paper, you should be winning, but you're not. Know why? Zimmerman said nothing. Because we don't care about the mathematics. We care about each other. And men who fight for their brothers are stronger than men who fight for abstract ideals like racial purity or living space or whatever propaganda Goebbels is selling this week. The silence stretched. Then Zimmerman laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. You truly believe that? That sentiment defeats strategy? I believe that men who trust each other fight harder than men who fear their commanders. I believe that crews who know they won't be abandoned take risks that rational, efficient, logical crews won't. And I believe that's why every day, despite your best efforts, American bombers keep hitting your factories, your rail yards, your cities, because we're fighting for something you can't calculate on a tactical chart. Zimmerman stubbed out his cigarette. You're describing mutual suicide. Both crews dying together instead of one crew surviving. Sometimes, but we'd rather die together than live knowing we abandoned our brothers. That's not suicide. That's loyalty. It's wasteful. It's why we're going to win. Zimmerman picked up his folder and stood. You're going to Stalagluft III tomorrow. The conditions are tolerable. You'll have food, shelter, medical care. You'll receive Red Cross parcels. You'll survive the war probably and go home to whatever remains of America after this conflict ends. He paused at the door. I'll make sure your file notes that you were cooperative and provided no intelligence value. I didn't cooperate, Dutch said. I just answered your question. The question about why Americans fight so stupidly. The question about why Americans fight so well. Zimmerman considered this, then. My son is a fighter pilot, 19 years old,
flies Messerschmitts over France. Every day I wake up wondering if this will be the day he encounters one of your bomber formations. If this will be the day his luck runs out. I'm sorry. Don't be. He chose to serve, as did I, as did you. Zimmerman opened the door. But I wonder sometimes, if your philosophy is correct, if Brotherhood really is stronger than tactics, then what does that say about us? About the war we're fighting? About the world we're creating? He left without waiting for an answer. Dutch sat alone in the too-warm room, the untouched beer still sitting on the table. He thought about his own crew. 9 men he'd trained with, flown with, trusted with his life. All of them dead now, except him and the ball turret gunner who'd bailed out 10 seconds before Dutch did. They died protecting each other, fighting for each other, refusing to abandon each other even when abandonment would have been logical. Was that stupid, wasteful, inefficient? Maybe. But it was also what separated men from machines, what made them human instead of just tactical assets in someone else's war. Dutch picked up the beer and took a long drink. It was warm now, not as good as it would have been 3 hours ago, but it was real and wet and reminded him that he was still alive, still human, still part of something bigger than tactical calculations and strategic planning. The door opened again. A guard appeared, young, barely 20, with the uncertain expression of someone who'd drawn the short straw for an unpleasant duty. Common, the guard said. Dutch stood and followed him down a corridor, past other interrogation rooms where other captured airmen were going through the same process. Some were officers like him, others were enlisted, gunners, navigators, bombardiers. All of them worn down by capture, by fear, by the sudden transition from warrior to prisoner. They reached a holding area where 24 other American airmen waited. Dutch recognized several faces from the processing line at Oberursel. A few nodded to him. Most sat in exhausted silence, processing their new reality. A technical sergeant, bombardier, judging by his insignia, looked up as Dutch entered. You get the beer offer? Yeah. Me too. Did you drink it? Eventually. The sergeant grinned slightly. Major Zimmerman. Does that whole routine with everyone. Tries to be your buddy, get you talking. Some of the guys fell for it. Told him all kinds of stuff about morale and training and equipment problems. Did you? Hell no. Name, rank, serial number. That's it. The sergeant paused, though he asked me something strange. What? Why we stay in formation when bombers get hit? Why we don't break away and save ourselves? The sergeant shook his head, like it's some big mystery, like he can't understand why we protect each other. What did you tell him? Same thing I'd tell anyone. We're Americans. We don't leave our people behind. Thought everybody knew that. Dutch smiled. Maybe not everybody. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the sun was setting. Another day ending. Another day survived. Tomorrow they'd be transferred to permanent prison camps. Tomorrow they'd begin the long wait for the war to end, for liberation, for the chance to go home. But tonight, sitting in a holding cell with other captured airmen, Dutch felt something unexpected. Pride. Not pride in being captured, not pride in failing to complete his mission, but pride in being part of an air force that valued brotherhood over tactics, that measured success by men saved rather than enemies killed, that taught its crews that no one gets left behind, even when leaving them behind would be smarter, safer, more efficient. The Germans could calculate all they wanted. They could optimize their tactics, streamline their logistics, maximize their efficiency. They could build better fighters, develop better weapons, train better pilots. But they couldn't manufacture what American airmen brought to the sky every day. They couldn't manufacture loyalty, brotherhood, the absolute certainty that your crew would die trying to save you rather than let you die alone. And in the end, Dutch thought, that might make all the difference. Hey, the sergeant said quietly, you think we're winning? The war, I mean. Feels like we're losing.
when you're sitting in a German prison camp. Dutch thought about the formations he'd flown with, the missions he'd completed, the factories destroyed, the rail yards bombed, the steady grinding pressure that American bombers applied day after day after day. Yeah, he said finally, we're winning, slowly, expensively, but we're winning. How can you tell? Dutch gestured around the holding cell. Because we're still fighting for each other. The day we stop doing that is the day we lose. Until then, he smiled, we're going to be just fine. The sergeant nodded slowly.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
Outside, night fell over Germany. Somewhere above, more American bombers were returning to England after another mission. Some had made it. Some hadn't. Some crews were whole. Others had empty seats at the dinner table tonight. But they'd all fought together, protected each other, refused to let tactics override humanity. And tomorrow, more bombers would take off. More crews would fly into hell. More men would die or be captured or survive against impossible odds. But none of them would fly alone. That was the American way. That was what the Germans couldn't understand. That was why, despite everything, Dutch Vandermeer believed they'd win.
June 22nd, 1943. 31,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley, Germany. Hauptmann Friedrich Meyer pulled back on the control stick, his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 climbing through thin air toward the American bomber stream. This was his 73rd combat mission. His 47th kill was confirmed 2 weeks ago. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of only a few hundred Luftwaffe pilots to receive such recognition. He was an ace, an expert, a killer. And for the first time in 4 years of war, he was afraid. Not the normal fear, the adrenaline spike before combat, the heightened awareness that kept you alive. This was different. This was the cold, creeping understanding that something fundamental had changed, that the war he knew how to fight was ending, and a new war he didn't understand was beginning. Achtung! Fighters! American fighters at 3 o'clock high. The call came from Lieutenant Paul Richter, flying wing position. Meyer's head snapped right and he saw them. Sleek twin-engine aircraft with distinctive twin-boom tails diving out of the sun. P-38 Lightnings. American escort fighters. This far into Germany. All aircraft, brake right. Meyer shouted into his radio. Engage the escorts. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was wrong. The whole tactical foundation of Luftwaffe bomber defense had been built on a simple assumption. American heavy bombers couldn't be escorted deep into German territory. Their fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfires, had limited range. They could protect the bombers to the border, maybe 100 kilometers inside Germany, but then they had to turn back. Which meant German fighters could attack the bombers without interference for most of the mission, could pick them apart methodically, could focus entirely on destroying the bombers rather than fighting enemy fighters. That assumption was ending today. The P-38s came in fast, their twin Allison engines howling. Meyer broke hard left, trying to position for a deflection shot. His wingman stayed with him. Good. Together they had a chance. Alone they'd be torn apart. The lead P-38 opened fire. Tracers walked toward Meyer's aircraft. He jinked right, then pulled into a climb, using the Messerschmitt's superior vertical performance to gain altitude advantage. The P-38 followed, slower but determined. Meyer leveled out at 33,000 feet and looked for his wingman. Richter was gone. Not dead, just gone, separated in the chaos of the engagement. Below, German fighters and American escorts swirled in a massive dogfight that stretched across 20 cubic kilometers of sky. And beyond the fighters, untouched and unmolested, the bomber formations continued eastward toward their targets. This was the nightmare scenario, the one thing that could break the entire German defense system. American bombers with fighter escort all the way to the target.
Mayer's radio erupted with calls. I'm hit. Bailing out. 2 lightnings on me. Can't shake them. Where are the bombers? I've lost sight of the bombers. Chaos. Confusion. The orderly tactical system dissolving into desperate individual combat. Mayer made a decision. He dove away from the dogfight, diving toward the bomber stream. His job was to kill bombers, not dogfight with escorts. Let the other fighters handle the P-38s. He'd go for the primary targets. He leveled out 2,000 feet above the lead formation, 96 B-17s flying in stacked combat boxes, their contrails drawing geometric patterns across the blue sky. He selected a target in the high element, pushed the throttle to combat power, and dive. At 600 meters, the bombers opened fire. At 400 meters, a P-38 came out of nowhere and latched onto his tail. Mayer swore and broke off the attack, pulling into a hard right turn. The P-38 stayed with him. Cannon shells walked past his canopy, 20mm rounds that would tear his fighter apart if they connected. He reversed his turn, rolled inverted, and pulled through into a split S that should have left the P-38 behind. The lightning stayed right with him. Mayer's altitude was bleeding away. 28,000 feet, 25,000 feet, 22,000 feet. The P-38 pilot was good, patient, disciplined, maintaining perfect firing position. Mayer tried every trick he knew. Barrel rolls, snap turns, scissors maneuvers. Nothing worked. At 18,000 feet, his engine started running rough. He'd pushed the throttle too hard for too long. The Daimler-Benz DB605 was overheating. The P-38 was still there. Mayer made another decision. He rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive, almost vertical, building speed rapidly, using gravity and the Messerschmitt's weight to outrun the American fighter. The altimeter unwound. 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet, 9,000 feet. At 6,000 feet, he pulled out of the dive, bleeding off speed in a bone-crushing turn. His vision tunneled. The G-suit squeezed his legs. He gasped against the pressure and fought to stay conscious.
When his vision cleared, the P-38 was gone. Mayer leveled out and checked his gauges. Engine temperature was critical. Oil pressure was dropping. He had maybe 10 minutes of flight time before the engine seized completely. He turned west, toward his base at Rhine, and climbed to conserve fuel. Around him, the sky was empty. The bombers had continued east. The fighters had moved on to other engagements. He was alone. His radio crackled. All aircraft, bomber formation, heading for Hull's synthetic rubber plant. Secondary formation targeting Gelsenkirchen. All available fighters respond. Mayer didn't respond. His aircraft was damaged, his fuel was low, his engine was dying. He was out of the fight. He made it back to Rhine with the engine temperature gauge buried in the red. He landed with smoke trailing from the cowling, the engine making sounds that meant it would never fly again. The ground crew ran towards his aircraft with fire extinguishers. Mayer shut down the dying engine and sat in the cockpit, hands shaking. 73 combat missions, 47 kills, 4 years of war. And today, for the first time, he'd been completely outmatched. Not by superior skill or better tactics, but by simple logistics. The Americans had brought fighters that could escort the bombers all the way to the target. The entire tactical equation had changed. And the Luftwaffe had no answer. His crew chief appeared at the wing. "Herr Hauptmann, are you injured?" No. Mayer unstrapped and climbed down. His legs were weak. "The engine?" "Finished. We'll need to replace the entire power plant." The crew chief looked at the smoking cowling. What happened up there? The future happened. Mayer walked to the operations building, where Major Balmer was studying reconnaissance photographs with the intelligence officer, Cole. They both looked up as Mayer entered. "Friedrich," Balmer stood. "We heard your transmission. Are you—"
I'm fine. The aircraft isn't. Mayer collapsed into a chair. They had escorts. All the way to the target. P-38s. Cole consulted his notes. Yes, we've been tracking this development. The Americans have been extending their escort range progressively. The P-38 has drop tanks now, additional fuel capacity that allows... I know what drop tanks are, Mayer interrupted. What I want to know is how we're supposed to fight when the bombers have fighter escort all the way to the target and back. Silence. Balmer and Cole exchanged glances. Then Balmer sat down heavily. We've been discussing that question, Balmer said quietly. The answer is, we're not sure. Not sure? Mayer's voice rose. Carl, I had 47 kills. 47. I'm one of the best pilots in the Geschwader, and today I couldn't even reach the bombers. One P-38 pilot kept me defensive for 15 minutes until my engine quit. I didn't fire a single shot at the enemy. It's happening across all sectors, Cole said. The Americans are bringing longer-range escorts, P-38s today. Soon they'll have P-51 Mustangs, even longer range, better performance. Within 6 months, they'll be able to escort bombers anywhere in Germany. Then we need more fighters, better fighters, new tactics. We're working on all of that, Balmer said. But Friedrich, you need to understand the mathematics. The Americans are producing 4-engine bombers faster than we can shoot them down. They're training replacement crews faster than we can kill the existing ones. And now they're deploying escort fighters that neutralize our tactical advantages. Mayer stared at him. You're saying we can't win. I'm saying the air war is entering a new phase. One where American industrial capacity and numerical superiority matter more than German pilot skill and tactical innovation. That's defeatist talk. That's reality. Balmer's voice was tired. We shot down 61 American bombers in May. Do you know how many they sent in June? More than in May. They absorbed the losses and came back stronger. That's not courage, Friedrich. That's industrial capacity. That's a level of resource availability we simply cannot match. Mayer wanted to argue, wanted to insist that superior German tactics and technology would prevail, wanted to believe that his 47 kills meant something more than just temporary delays in an inevitable outcome. But he'd seen the bomber formations today, seen how they kept coming despite losses, seen how they protected each other, adjusted to tactics, learned from experience. And now they had fighters that could escort them all the way. The equation had changed. What do we do? Mayer asked quietly. Balmer stood and walked to the window. Outside, ground crews were working on damaged fighters, preparing them for the next mission. Young men, most of them teenagers, doing their jobs with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd stopped thinking about the larger picture.
We keep fighting, Balmer said. We shoot down as many as we can. We protect our cities and factories as long as possible. We buy time for... He trailed off. For what? Mayer pressed. Buy time for what, Carl? I don't know anymore. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cole cleared his throat. If I may, Herr Major, there have been some interesting developments in our interrogations of captured American airmen. We're learning things about their psychology, their motivation, their command philosophy. Such as? Balmer asked. They're taught to never abandon each other. It's not just tactical guidance. It's deeply embedded in their culture, their training, their self-identity as airmen. When we ask them why they take such risks to protect damaged aircraft, they seem genuinely confused by the question, as if the alternative, abandoning wounded comrades, is literally unthinkable. We know this already, Mayer said impatiently. They're sentimental. So what? So, Cole continued, that philosophy has tactical implications. It means they'll consistently choose protection over efficiency, brotherhood over optimization. They'll sacrifice strategic advantages for emotional satisfaction. And yet they're winning, Balmer said softly. Are they? Cole looked surprised. We're still inflicting massive casualties. The mathematics.
The mathematics don't matter if they have unlimited resources. Bomber turned from the window. Don't you see? They can afford to be sentimental because they have enough bombers, enough crews, enough fighters to absorb losses that would cripple us. Their philosophy isn't a weakness. It's a luxury afforded by industrial capacity we can't match. Maya felt something cold settle in his chest. You're saying we've already lost? I'm saying we're fighting a different war than they are. We're fighting for territory and resources and strategic objectives. They're fighting for each other. And when one side has unlimited resources, the side fighting for each other has a morale advantage we can't overcome. The room fell silent. Maya thought about the P-38 pilot who chased him for 15 minutes. That American had risked his own fuel, his own safety, to keep one German fighter away from the bombers. Not because it was tactically essential. There were dozens of other German fighters in the sky. But because every bomber that made it through was full of men who mattered more than tactics. That was the difference. German pilots fought for victory. American pilots fought for their brothers. And when brothers fight for brothers, they don't stop just because the mathematics say they should. What do we tell the other pilots? Maya asked. How do we explain that we're fighting a war we can't win? We don't, Balmer said firmly. We tell them to keep fighting, to shoot down as many bombers as possible, to make the Americans pay for every kilometer they penetrate, every factory they hit, every city they burn. He paused. Because even if we can't win, we can make them remember what victory cost. It wasn't inspiring. It wasn't hopeful. But it was honest. Maya stood. My aircraft needs a new engine. How long? 3 days, Cole said. Maybe 4. Make it 3. The Americans will be back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Maya walked to the door, then stopped. Carl. Yes? When this is over, when the war ends, what do you think they'll say about us? The Americans. Will they understand that we were just doing our duty? That we were good pilots fighting for our country? Balmer was quiet for a long moment. I think they'll say we fought well, but I don't think they'll understand why we fought alone while they fought together. Maya nodded and left. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and red. The same sky the American bombers were flying through, heading back to England after another mission, some damaged, some dying, but none alone. Never alone. Maya thought about his 47 kills, 47 American aircraft destroyed, maybe 400 American airmen killed, 400 men who trusted each other, protected each other, died for each other. And tomorrow, more would come. Not because they didn't know the risks, not because they didn't understand the mathematics, but because some things mattered more than survival. Some things, like brotherhood, like loyalty, like refusing to abandon the men beside you, mattered more than winning efficiently. The Americans had understood that from the beginning. The Germans were only learning it now, when it was too late to matter. Maya lit a cigarette and watched the sunset, wondering how many more sunsets he'd see before the war ended, before the Americans' industrial capacity and unbreakable brotherhood ground the Luftwaffe into dust. Not many, probably. But he'd fight anyway, because that's what good pilots did. They fought until they won or died, or the war ended. Even when they knew the ending was already written. August 17th, 1943. Regensburg Schweinfurt Mission. 25,000 feet above Bavaria. Staff Sergeant Anthony Tony Rizzo crouched in the ball turret of Memphis Belle II, watching the German countryside slide past 25,000 feet below. The plexiglass sphere was cramped and cold and gave him a 360-degree view of everything that wanted to kill him. Right now, that was a lot. Fighters! 9 o'clock low. The call came from the waist gunner, Danny Morrison. Tony rotated his turret and saw them. 6 Messerschmitts climbing in formation, positioning for an attack run. He tracked the lead fighter with his twin 5 calibers, waiting for them to enter range. This was Tony's 23rd mission. 2 more, and he'd complete his tour. 2 more, and he could go home to Brooklyn, to his family, to a life where the biggest danger was crossing Flatbush Avenue during rush hour, instead of sitting in a glass bubble while German fighters tried to blow him out of the sky. 2 more missions. If he survived today. The Messerschmitts attacked from below, coming up fast. Tony opened fire at 400 yards, long range, but sometimes you got lucky. His tracers arced through space, converging where the fighters would be if they maintained course and speed. They didn't. They scattered, breaking formation to avoid his fire. 2 went left, 3 went right, 1 pulled up hard. Tony tracked the 1 pulling up, leading his target, squeezing the trigger in controlled bursts. His rounds walked up the fighter's belly. Pieces flew off. Smoke trailed. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away. Hit. I got a hit. Tony shouted into the intercom. Good shooting, Ball. Lieutenant Fletcher's voice came back. Their pilot calm as always. Stay alert. More coming. Tony rotated the turret, scanning for threats. The formation was under attack from multiple directions, fighters hitting them high and low, from front and rear. This was the Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission. The sky was full of tracer fire, exploding flak, and aircraft maneuvering desperately. The big one. The mission that was supposed to cripple German ball-bearing production and aircraft manufacturing. They'd been briefed that it would be tough. They hadn't been told it would be suicide. The formation had already lost a dozen bombers. Tony had watched them go down, some exploding in mid-air, some spinning toward earth-trailing fire, some simply breaking apart when structural damage exceeded what the aircraft could handle. He'd counted parachutes when he could, trying not to think about the men who didn't get out. Men he'd trained with, flown with, shared meals and jokes and fears with. Fighter coming up from 5 o'clock. Tony rotated toward the threat. A Focke-Wulf 190 was climbing toward them, nose guns already flashing. He squeezed his triggers. His guns hammered, the sound filling the tiny ball turret. Spent casings ejected into the collection bag. The turret filled with the smell of cordite and gun oil. The Focke-Wulf's rounds hit Memphis Belle too. Tony heard the impacts, sharp metallic bangs as 20mm cannon shells punched through aluminum. The bomber shuddered. Somewhere above him, someone screamed. We're hit, Fletcher's voice, still calm, but with an edge now. Number 3, engines on fire, feathering the prop. How's everyone doing? The crew reported in, one by one. 9 voices, except the tail gunner, Billy Chen, didn't respond. Billy, Fletcher called. Tail gunner, report. Silence. Morrison, check on Billy. Tony heard footsteps through the aircraft structure. Morrison moving through the fuselage toward the tail. Then Morrison's voice, thick with something that might have been grief or fear or both. He's gone, Skipper. Took a 20mm through the turret. He's gone. The intercom went silent. Billy Chen, 22 years old, from San Francisco, who sent half his pay home to his parents every month, who played harmonica in the barracks, who'd promised his little sister he'd bring her a German helmet as a souvenir. Gone. Acknowledged, Fletcher said quietly. Everyone else, stay sharp. We've still got a long way to go. But Memphis Belle II was dying. Tony could feel it. The way the aircraft handled differently now, sluggish and wounded. They'd lost an engine. They were losing altitude. And they were deep in Germany with hours of hostile territory between them and safety. The bomber to their right, Lucky Strike, was in worse shape. Both inboard engines were smoking. The tail section was torn up. But they were still flying, still in formation, still heading for the target. Fletcher, this is Wilson. That was the pilot of Lucky Strike. His voice crackled over the radio. We're in bad shape. Don't think we'll make it back.
Copy that, Lucky Strike. What's your status?
3 engines damaged, hydraulics failing, controls getting mushy. We're going to drop our bombs and try for Switzerland. Switzerland, neutral territory. If they could reach the Swiss border, they could land there and sit out the rest of the war as internees. Not home, but alive. Tony watched Lucky Strike through his turret. The bomber was struggling, losing altitude steadily despite the pilot's efforts. Smoke poured from the damaged engines. The crew was surely discussing bailout procedures, checking their parachutes, preparing for the possibility that they'd have to jump. Then something unexpected happened. Memphis Belle II dropped back from formation, Fletcher reducing power, matching Lucky Strike's slower speed. "Skipper?" Tony called over the intercom. "Why are we slowing down?" "We're staying with Lucky Strike," Fletcher said. "They need cover." "But Skipper, we're hit too. We need to maintain altitude, conserve fuel." "I know what we need, Sergeant. We're staying with them." Tony understood then. Fletcher was throwing away their best chance of survival to protect a dying aircraft that probably wouldn't make it anyway. By tactical logic, it was insane. By American logic, it was inevitable. Because nobody gets left alone to die. Another bomber dropped back with them, Devil's Daughter, piloted by Captain James Garrett, who had a reputation for being the best formation pilot in the squadron. His aircraft was healthy, undamaged. He had no tactical reason to leave the protection of the main formation. "Fletcher, this is Garrett. We'll take the right wing. Morrison, this is Garrett's top turret. Coordinate fire sectors so we don't overlap." "Roger that, Devil's Daughter." 3 bombers, 1 healthy, 2 damaged, flying together below the main formation, slower, more vulnerable, drawing fighters like blood draws sharks. And the fighters came. They attacked in waves, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, hitting from every angle. Tony fired until his guns were hot enough to cook on. He tracked targets, led his shots, squeezed off bursts that sometimes connected and sometimes didn't. A Messerschmitt came straight up at them from 6 o'clock low. Tony caught it with a burst that stitched across the canopy. The fighter rolled away, trailing smoke. He didn't know if the pilot was dead or just wounded, and he didn't have time to care. More fighters, more tracers, more impacts against Memphis Belle II's battered airframe. "Number 4 engine just quit," Fletcher reported. "We're on 2 engines now. This is going to be tight." 2 engines, half their power. They were losing altitude faster now, dropping below 20,000 feet. The main formation was pulling ahead, shrinking in the distance. Soon they'd be completely alone, except for Lucky Strike and Devil's Daughter. "Skipper," Morrison called from the waist. "Lucky Strike just took another hit. Their number 1 engine's on fire." Tony rotated his turret to see. Lucky Strike was trailing heavy smoke now from 2 engines. The bomber was shaking, violent oscillations that meant structural damage. They had minutes left maybe. "Lucky Strike, this is Fletcher. What's your situation?" Wilson's voice came back, strained. "We're done, Memphis. Can't maintain altitude. We're going to have to bail out." "Understood. We'll cover you." "Negative, Fletcher. No point getting yourself killed for us. We're already gone." "Nobody asked you, Wilson. Start the bailout procedure. We'll keep the fighters off you until everyone's out." There was a pause. Then Wilson's voice again, quieter. "Thank you, Memphis." "Don't mention it. See you after the war."
Tony watched as Lucky Strike's crew began bailing out. The bomb bay doors opened. They'd already dropped their bombs over the target. Figures tumbled from the aircraft, parachutes blossoming white against the green German countryside below. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 3 men unaccounted for, dead, trapped, or too injured to jump. A Messerschmitt dove toward the falling parachutes. Tony's blood went cold. Shooting parachuting airmen was against the rules of war, but it happened. Some pilots couldn't resist the easy targets. Devil's Daughter's top turret opened fire. Long burst, perfectly aimed. The Messerschmitt broke off its dive and climbed away. Don't even think about it. Garrett's gunner transmitted on the common frequency, speaking directly to the German pilot, who probably couldn't understand English, but would understand the message. Lucky Strike, now empty, began its final spiral. The aircraft rolled left, nose dropping, accelerating toward the ground. Tony watched until it disappeared behind clouds. Somewhere down there, it would crash into a German field or forest. The crew would be captured, interrogated, sent to prison camps. But they'd be alive. 7 out of 10. Because Memphis Belle II and Devil's Daughter had stayed with them, protected them, bought them time to escape a dying aircraft. "All right," Fletcher said. "Let's get ourselves home. Right beside you, Memphis. Garrett, you still with us? Let's go find England." They turned west, 2 bombers limping home. Fletcher coaxed every bit of performance from Memphis Belle II's remaining 2 engines. They dropped to 15,000 feet to reduce strain, flying slower than they should, burning fuel they couldn't afford to waste. But they flew together. More fighters came. Tony fought them off, his guns hot, ammunition running low. Devil's Daughter's gunners protected Memphis Belle II's blind spots. Together, they created a defensive envelope that kept the German fighters cautious. They crossed into Belgium at 12,000 feet. The Low Countries were still occupied territory, still dangerous, but the fighter attacks lessened. The Luftwaffe pilots needed fuel too, and their bases were behind them now. At 9,000 feet, they crossed the coast, saw the English Channel stretching ahead, grey-green and infinite. Safety, home, survival. Tony's ammunition was almost gone. His turret was so cold his hands were numb. He'd been crouched in this plexiglass ball for 7 hours, watching men die, fighting to stay alive, protecting his brothers. And they'd made it. "Coast of England ahead," Fletcher announced. "We're going to make it, boys. We're going to make it." A cheer went up over the intercom. Morrison whooped. The top turret gunner, Jenkins, started singing "God Bless America" off-key. Even Fletcher laughed, a sound Tony had rarely heard from their stoic pilot. They landed at Bassingbourn 50 minutes later. Memphis Belle touched down with 2 engines, damaged controls, and 847 bullet and shrapnel holes. The ground crew counted them afterward, shaking their heads in disbelief that the aircraft had stayed airborne. Devil's Daughter landed right behind them, pristine and undamaged except for a few bullet holes in the tail. Tony climbed out of the ball turret, his legs cramping, his hands shaking from adrenaline and cold. Fletcher was already on the ground, helping the crew out, checking everyone for injuries. Captain Garrett walked over from Devil's Daughter, still wearing his oxygen mask around his neck.
Hell of a mission, Fletcher. Yeah. Fletcher looked at Memphis Belle II's battered airframe. Lost Billy. Lost Lucky Strike. Almost lost everyone. But you didn't. Garrett put a hand on Fletcher's shoulder. 7 men from Lucky Strike are alive because you stayed with them. That counts for something. Does it? Fletcher's voice was tired. We could have stayed with the formation, made it back faster, safer. The math says we should have left them. Math doesn't fly bombers. Men do. And men don't abandon their brothers. Garrett smiled slightly. That's why we're Americans, Fletcher. That's why we're going to win this thing. Tony listened to this exchange, thinking about the mission. About Billy Chen, dead in his tail turret. About Wilson and his crew, falling toward German soil. About the dozens of bombers that hadn't made it back today. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission would go down as one of the bloodiest raids of the war. 60 bombers lost. 600 men dead or captured. For what? To hit ball-bearing factories that would be repaired in weeks? To prove that American bombers could hit targets deep in Germany? Or to prove something else entirely? Tony looked at Memphis Belle II, then at Devil's Daughter. then at Fletcher and Garrett standing together in the English afternoon sun. They hadn't won today, not tactically. The losses were horrific. The damage to German industry was temporary. By any military calculation, today was at best a marginal success and at worst a disaster. But 7 men from Lucky Strike were alive. Memphis Belle II had made it home. Devil's Daughter had protected them both. And across the 8th Air Force, across every bomber group in England, the same story was repeating. Damaged bombers escorted home by healthy ones. Fighter pilots extending beyond their fuel limits to protect struggling bombers. Crews risking everything to save each other. The Germans were right about one thing. It was expensive, wasteful even. The mathematics were terrible. But mathematics couldn't measure what mattered. Brotherhood. Loyalty. The absolute certainty that no American airman would be left alone to die if his brothers could prevent it. That was worth dying for. That was worth fighting for. That was worth winning for. Tony walked toward the barracks, his body exhausted, his mind still processing everything he'd seen and done. 2 more missions. If he survived 2 more missions, he'd go home. But part of him would stay here, in the sky over Germany, with Billy Chen and all the others who'd paid the price for proving that some things mattered more than tactics. Some things mattered more than survival. Some things were worth any cost. Behind him, ground crews swarmed over Memphis Belle II, assessing damage, marking repairs needed. The bomber would fly again. Maybe not soon, but eventually. Just like the 8th Air Force would fly again tomorrow, and the day after. Until the war ended. Until they won. Until every German pilot understood what American airmen had known from the beginning. You can't defeat men who refuse to abandon each other. You can't break formations built on brotherhood. You can't kill an ideal that says every life matters more than any victory. The Germans could shoot down 1,000 bombers. They could kill 10,000 American airmen. They could win every tactical engagement. But they couldn't win the war. Because they were fighting alone. And Americans never flew alone.
November 4th, 1943. Luftwaffe Base, Oldenburg, Germany. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann sat in the ready room, staring at a cup of ersatz coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Outside, mechanics worked on his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, patching holes, replacing damaged components, preparing it for tomorrow's inevitable combat. Tomorrow. There was always a tomorrow. Always another mission. Always more American bombers. The door opened and Major Karl Baumer walked in, carrying a folder that looked too thin for the weight he seemed to be carrying. He sat down across from Hoffmann without speaking, laid the folder on the table between them, and stared at it like it contained something poisonous. "How many today?" Hoffmann asked. 16 confirmed kills across all Geschwaders defending the Ruhr. Maybe 25 total, including probables. Baumer's voice was flat. The Americans sent 384 bombers. Hoffmann did the math. 16 confirmed out of 384, 4%. 96% of the American bomber force had hit their targets and returned to England. Our losses. 11 pilots. 7 dead. 4 captured. 23 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. Baumer opened the folder. "We're losing the war, Klaus." It wasn't a question. It wasn't defeatism. It was just a statement of fact, delivered by a man too tired to pretend anymore. "I know," Hoffmann said quietly. "Do you? Do you really understand what's happening?" Baumer pulled out a sheet of paper covered in numbers. In January, the Americans were sending 50 to 80 bombers per mission. Now they're sending 300-400. By spring, it'll be 500, maybe more. And they're bringing fighters, P-47s, P-38s, and soon P-51s that can escort them anywhere in Germany. He pointed at another column of numbers. In January, we were shooting down 8 to 10% of attacking bombers.
Good numbers. Sustainable. By March, it dropped to 6%. Now it's 4%. Next month, it'll be 3%. We're becoming less effective, even as they're becoming more numerous. We need more fighters, Hoffmann said. Better tactics. More. We need a time machine. Bomber's laugh was bitter. We need to go back to 1941 and strangle the American industrial capacity before it fully mobilized. But we can't. So instead, we sit here and watch them grind us into dust. Hoffmann had no response. What could he say? That German ingenuity would prevail. That superior tactics would overcome numerical disadvantage. Those were the lies they told the younger pilots, the ones who still believed in victory. But Hoffmann had been flying against the Americans for 9 months now. He'd watched them learn, adapt, improve. He'd seen their formations become tighter, their gunnery more accurate, their tactics more sophisticated. He'd watched damaged bombers refuse to break formation, watched healthy crews risk everything to protect wounded aircraft, watched the absolute commitment they had to each other. And he'd realized something that terrified him. The Americans were getting better at war faster than the Germans were getting better at stopping them. I spoke with a captured American pilot yesterday, Hoffmann said. Captain Michael Henderson shot down over Munster. His entire crew died except him. He bailed out at 3,000 feet, barely enough altitude for his chute to open. So I asked him the question I always ask. Why do you keep coming back? Why do you fly into hell itself day after day when you know the odds are against you? Why do you risk everything for missions that might not even succeed? Balmer looked up. What did he say? He said, because if I don't fly, someone else has to take my place, and that someone might have a family waiting for him, or a girl, or parents who need him. So I fly because every mission I complete is one less mission someone else has to fly. One less chance that someone else's family gets a telegram. The room was quiet. That's it? Balmer asked. That's their philosophy? They fly to spare others from flying? No. That's deeper than philosophy. That's... Hoffmann searched for the word. That's love. Not romantic love. Not patriotic love. Just simple human love for the men beside you. The belief that their lives matter as much as yours. Maybe more. Balmer stood and walked to the window. Outside, ground crews worked under floodlights, preparing fighters for the next day's operations. Young men, some barely 18, doing their jobs with mechanical efficiency. We teach our pilots to be efficient killers, Balmer said quietly. We teach tactics, gunnery, energy management, situational awareness. We teach them to survive and to kill. What we don't teach them is why any of it matters beyond duty and victory. And the Americans? The Americans teach their pilots that the man beside them matters more than the mission, that bringing your crew home is more important than hitting the target, that no one gets left behind, even when leaving them behind would be tactically sound. Balmer turned from the window, and somehow, inexplicably, that philosophy is destroying us. Hoffmann thought about the hundreds of engagements he'd flown, the patterns he'd observed, the tactical decisions that didn't make sense until you understood the American mindset. Damaged bombers staying in formation, even though breaking away would increase their survival chances, because the formation protected them better than speed and isolation could.
Healthy bombers slowing down to escort wounded aircraft, because abandoning them was unthinkable. Fighter pilots extending beyond their fuel safety margins to protect struggling bombers, because those bomber crews were their brothers. Every single decision prioritized human connection over tactical efficiency, and every single decision, paradoxically, made the American bomber offensive stronger. It shouldn't work, Hoffmann said. By every tactical principle we know, their philosophy should make them weaker, more vulnerable, easier to defeat. But it doesn't. No, it doesn't. The door opened again. A young lieutenant entered, fresh-faced, barely 20, wearing a uniform so new it still had creases from the tailor.
He saluted sharply. Herr Major Baumer, Oberleutnant Hoffmann. I'm Lieutenant Hans Weber, assigned to 3rd Staffel. I'm reporting for duty. Baumer returned the salute wearily. Welcome, Lieutenant. How many flight hours do you have? 217 hours, Herr Major. 43 hours in the Bf 109. Hoffmann closed his eyes. 43 hours. This boy, and he was a boy, had less time in fighters than Hoffmann logged in a typical month. They were sending children to fight a war that required veterans. Have you ever fired your guns in combat? Baumer asked. No, Herr Major, but I scored very well in gunnery training, top of my class. Training. Baumer's voice carried a weight that made Weber's enthusiasm falter. Lieutenant, training prepares you for the mechanics of flight and combat. It doesn't prepare you for what happens when a B-17's waist gunner puts a burst of .50 caliber rounds through your canopy, or when you watch a friend's aircraft explode, or when you realize the bomber stream just keeps coming, no matter how many you shoot down. Weber stood straighter. I understand, Herr Major. I'm ready to serve. No one is ready for this, Hoffmann said quietly, but you'll learn, or you'll die, probably both, in that order. The young pilot looked confused. Baumer waved him toward a chair. Sit down, Weber. Let me tell you what you're facing. The Americans fly in combat box formations, staggered altitudes, overlapping fields of fire. Each B-17 has 13.50 caliber machine guns. A typical formation has 96 bombers, which means 1,248 guns, all coordinated, all aimed at you. He pulled out a diagram showing the combat box formation. Your Messerschmitt is fast and maneuverable. Their bombers are slow and heavy, but they don't fly alone. They fly together, protecting each other. And now they have fighter escorts, P-47s that can match your performance, and P-51s that are coming soon, better than anything we have. Weber studied the diagram, his earlier confidence eroding. Your job is to break up the formations, shoot down as many bombers as possible, and survive to fly again tomorrow. The Americans' job is to protect each other and hit their targets. They're very good at their job, Lieutenant. Better than we've been at ours lately. But, sir, we're German pilots. We have better training, better tactics. We have dying traditions fighting a living enemy, Hoffmann interrupted. We fly alone. They fly together. We fight for victory. They fight for each other. And in the arithmetic of this war, Brotherhood is beating individualism. Weber looked between Hoffmann and Baumer, seeking reassurance that never came. I should tell you the statistics, Baumer said, but I'm not sure they'd help. Let's just say that if you survive 3 months, you'll be a veteran. 6 months, an ace. A year? He shrugged. There aren't many who make it a year anymore. The room fell silent. Weber's face had gone pale. Why are you telling me this? The young pilot asked quietly. Shouldn't you be, I don't know, inspiring confidence? We're building morale? I'm telling you this, Baumer said, because the Luftwaffe is broken. Not in equipment or tactics or training. We're still excellent in all those areas. We're broken in spirit. We're fighting a war we can't win against an enemy we can't understand. And I'd rather you know that now than discover it when a P-47 is on your tail and you realize your training didn't prepare you for opponents who protect each other with religious fervor. Hoffmann stood and walked to the window beside Baumer. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of aircraft engines, night fighters scrambling to intercept RAF bombers. The British by night, the Americans by day. No rest, no respite, just constant grinding pressure. The Americans have a phrase, Hoffmann said. They say no man left behind. It's not just a motto. It's their entire military philosophy compressed into 4 words. Every decision they make, every tactic they employ, every risk they take, it all comes back to those 4 words. And we? Weber asked. We say duty, honor, fatherland. Noble concepts. But they're abstract, important values. Intellectual. The Americans' philosophy isn't abstract. It's personal, immediate. Every pilot knows
that if he goes down, his squadron will do everything possible to protect him. That knowledge creates a bond we simply don't have. Weber absorbed this, his young face creasing with thought. So what do we do? We fight, Bomber said simply, because that's what soldiers do. We fight until we win or lose or die or the war ends. We shoot down as many bombers as we can. We protect our cities as best we're able. We do our duty. Even if we can't win?
Especially if we can't win, because how you lose matters as much as whether you lose. Hoffmann thought about all the American pilots he'd fought over the past 9 months, the ones he'd shot down and the ones who'd nearly shot him down, the captured airmen he'd interrogated, trying to understand what made them so relentless. They weren't supermen. They weren't tactical geniuses. They were just men, young men mostly, far from home, scared and cold and exhausted. But they had something. The Luftwaffe had lost somewhere between Poland and Russia and North Africa and now Germany itself. They had each other. Not just as tactical units or military formations, but as brothers. They knew, absolutely knew, that if they went down, their comrades would risk everything to save them. That knowledge created courage that tactics couldn't instill and training couldn't replicate. The Luftwaffe had individual heroes, men like Hoffmann with dozens of kills, aces with Knight's Crosses and oak leaves and swords and diamonds. But the Americans had something better than heroes. They had Brotherhood. And in the end, that was making all the difference. Get some rest, Lieutenant, Bomber told Weber. Tomorrow you'll fly your first combat mission. Hoffmann will be your flight leader. Listen to him, follow his instructions, and maybe you'll survive to see next week. Weber stood and saluted. Thank you, Herr Major, Herr Oberleutnant. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. Bomber and Hoffmann stood in silence, watching the ground crews work. How long do you think he'll last? Bomber asked. Week, maybe 2 if he's lucky and learns fast. That's what I thought. Bomber picked up his folder. I'm recommending you for promotion to Hauptmann. You've earned it. I don't want it. I know. You're getting it anyway. Bomber paused at the door. Klaus, can I ask you something? Of course. If you could go back to 1939, before any of this started, and you knew then what you know now about this war, about the Americans, about how it would all turn out, would you still fly? Hoffmann thought about this question, about the hundreds of missions, the dozens of kills, the friends lost, the enemy pilots shot down, the weight of 4 years of war pressing down on his shoulders. Yes, he said finally, because even if we can't win, someone has to stand between the bombers and our cities. Someone has to try. That's what soldiers do. Even knowing it's futile? Especially knowing it's futile. That's what makes it meaningful. Bowman nodded slowly. The Americans would understand that. They fly futile missions all the time. Missions where the odds are terrible and the losses are guaranteed. But they fly anyway because their brothers need them. Maybe we're not so different after all, Hoffmann said. Maybe. Or maybe we're exactly different enough that it matters.
Bowman opened the door. Get some sleep. Tomorrow the Americans will come again, and we'll be waiting. He left. Hoffmann remained at the window, watching the mechanics work, thinking about Weber and all the other young pilots who'd cycle through the squadron in the coming months. Most of them would die or be captured within weeks. A few might become aces. None of them would see victory. But they'd fly anyway. Because that's what German pilots did. They flew and fought and died for duty and honor and fatherland. While the Americans flew and fought and died for each other. And somehow, impossibly, that difference was deciding the war.
January 11th, 1944. 29,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. First, Lieutenant Jake Spider. Morrison gripped the control yoke of Devil's Advocate and watched his number 3 engine trail smoke,
The propeller was feathered, the engine dead. But the smoke kept coming, thick and black and utterly terrifying at 29,000 feet. "How's it looking back there, Ski?" he asked over the intercom. Technical Sergeant Mike Jankowski, the flight engineer, was somewhere in the fuselage trying to assess the damage. His voice came back strained. "Not good, Lieutenant. Looks like we took a 20mm through the cowling. Fire's out, but we're losing oil from number 4 too. That engine's going to quit any minute." 2 engines, out of 4. Deep in Germany, with maybe an hour of hostile territory before they reached friendly lines. The mathematics were simple and brutal. They weren't going to make it. "Navigator, give me a heading to Switzerland," Spider said. "Shortest route." "Roger." That was Lieutenant Danny Chen, their navigator. His brother Tommy had died over Germany 3 months ago. Danny had volunteered for another tour immediately after, saying someone had to finish what Tommy started. The intercom crackled with multiple voices. "Swiss? We're heading for Swiss? What about England?" "Skipper, we can make it home." Spider let them talk for a moment, then cut through. "Listen up. We're on 2 engines, maybe 2.5 before number 4 quits completely. We can't maintain altitude with the formation. We can't keep up their speed. If we try for England, we'll be alone over Germany for 2 hours. Every fighter in the Luftwaffe will have a shot at us." "But Switzerland means internment," Bombardier Carl Ramirez said. "We sit out the rest of the war." "We sit out the rest of the war alive," Spider countered, "which beats the alternative." Number 4 engine coughed. The RPM dropped, recovered slightly, then dropped again. Jankowski's voice came through. "She's dying, Skipper. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Spider made the decision. "Switzerland it is. Chen, that heading?" 170 degrees. Distance approximately 200 kilometers. "Copy. Coming to 170. Spider banked Devil's Advocate to the right, turning south, while the rest of the formation continued east toward Oschersleben. He watched the other bombers pull away, 95 aircraft continuing the mission while he ran for safety. It felt like desertion. It felt like failure. It felt like exactly what they'd trained not to do. But it was the right call. The only call. Devil's Advocate, this is Mustang Lead. The transmission startled Spider. He grabbed the radio. "Mustang Lead, this is Devil's Advocate. Go ahead." "We see you peeling off. What's your status?" Spider glanced out his left window and saw them. 4 P-51 Mustangs, the new long-range escort fighters that had only started showing up a few weeks ago. They were beautiful aircraft, all silver and power and lethal grace. "We're shot up, Mustang Lead. 2 engines out, heading for Switzerland. We'll be fine." "Negative, Devil's Advocate. You've got bandits coming up from your 6 o'clock. Looks like 4 contacts, probably 109s. They've spotted you." Spider's chest tightened. Of course they had. A damaged bomber leaving formation was exactly what German fighters hunted for. Easy prey, a confirmed kill. "Copy that, Mustang Lead. We'll do what we can." "Negative. We're coming with you." Spider blinked. "Say again?" "We're escorting you to Switzerland. Form up on us and we'll get you there." "But Mustang Lead, the main formation needs escorts. They're hitting Oschersleben. That's heavy fighter territory." "The main formation has 30 other Mustang flights protecting them. You've got nobody. We're coming with you." Before Spider could respond, the 4 P-51s peeled away from the bomber stream and dove toward Devil's Advocate. They formed up around the struggling B-17, 2 above, 2 flanking, creating a protective envelope. "Bandits are closing," Mustang Lead transmitted. "Stay steady, Devil's Advocate. We've got this." Spider watched through his side window as the German fighters approached. 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, climbing fast, vectoring toward the damaged bomber.
They had altitude advantage, speed advantage, positional advantage. They had everything except the element of surprise. The lead Mustang rolled inverted and dove. His wingman followed a second later. The two P-51s dropped like hawks, building speed, closing the distance to the climbing Messerschmitts in seconds. The Germans never saw them coming. The lead Mustang opened fire at 300 yards. Tracers converged on the lead 109. Pieces flew off. The Messerschmitt rolled left, trying to evade, but the Mustang pilot anticipated perfectly and followed the turn. Another burst. The 109's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled and began spinning toward Earth. The second Mustang engaged the number 2, 109. These German pilots were better. They scattered immediately, breaking formation to deny the Mustangs easy shots. The dogfight became a swirling chaos of aircraft climbing, diving, rolling through three-dimensional space. "Keep heading 170, Mustang lead ordered. We'll handle the welcoming committee." Spider held course, watching the two Mustangs above him while the two below engaged the German fighters. Number 4 engine quit completely. Just stopped, propeller windmilling uselessly before he feathered it. Now they were definitely on 2 engines, losing altitude slowly but steadily. 28,000 feet, 27,500 feet, 27,000 feet. Through the chaos of the dogfight, Spider watched one of the Messerschmitts break away and dive toward Devil's Advocate. The German pilot had seen the opportunity. While his comrades kept the Mustangs busy, he'd make a quick pass on the bomber and then escape. "Bandit coming in 12 o'clock high," top turret gunner Sam Rodriguez called. "I see him," Spider replied, holding the yoke steady. The Messerschmitt dive, building speed, lining up for a head-on attack. This was the most dangerous attack angle, closing speed over 600 miles per hour, both aircraft firing at each other, seconds to hit or miss before passing.
Spider could see the fighters' nose guns flashing. Tracers walked toward them. He held course, trusting his gunners, trusting the aircraft, trusting. A P-51 materialized from nowhere, cutting across the Messerschmitt's path. The Mustang pilot didn't even fire, just flew directly into the German fighter's flight path, forcing him to break off or collide. The 109 rolled hard right and dove away. "Told you we've got this," Mustang lead transmitted. The dogfight lasted another 3 minutes. When it ended, 2 Messerschmitts were smoking toward Earth, and the other 2 were running for home, outmatched and outfought by the Mustang pilots. The 4 P-51s reformed around Devil's Advocate, resuming their escort positions. "Thanks, Mustang lead," Spider said quietly. "You saved our bacon." "That's what we're here for. Now let's get you to Switzerland before someone else shows up." They flew south, losing altitude steadily, following Chen's navigation. The German countryside slid past below, towns and forests and fields covered in January snow. Somewhere down there, people were living their lives, probably unaware of the drama playing out in the sky above them. Spider thought about the Mustang pilots. They'd abandoned the main bomber formation, left dozens of B-17s without their protection, to escort one damaged aircraft to safety. By any tactical calculation, that was the wrong decision. 4 fighters could have made a difference, protecting 95 bombers. 4 fighters escorting 1 bomber was overkill. But they'd done it anyway. Because 1 bomber mattered. 10 American airmen mattered. The mission was important, but the men were sacred. "Skipper, I've got something on the horizon," Chen called. "Looks like... yeah, that's the Alps. We're close." Spider looked ahead and saw them. Distant mountain peaks white with snow, marking the border between Germany and Switzerland. Safety, neutrality, survival. "How's our fuel, Ski?" "Tight. Real tight. We're burning more than normal on 2 engines. I'd say we've got maybe 30 minutes. "That'll do." They crossed into Swiss airspace at 18,000 feet, 2 engines running rough,
fuel gauges hovering near empty. The Mustangs stayed with them until they were 10 kilometers past the border, then waggled their wings in salute and turned north. Good luck, devil's advocate. Stay safe. You too, Mustang Lid. Thank you for everything. Don't mention it. See you after the war. The P-51s climbed back toward Germany, back toward the fight, back toward the bomber stream they'd left to protect one damaged B-17. Spider watched them go, feeling something tight in his chest that might have been gratitude or respect or simple human appreciation. All right, crew, he said over the intercom. We're looking for a place to land. Chen, find us a Swiss airfield, preferably one that's long and flat. Roger that, skipper. They found Dubendorf Airport 20 minutes later. Spider lined up on final approach, called the tower in broken German, and brought Devil's Advocate down with 2 engines, no hydraulics, and 37 holes in the airframe. The landing gear deployed manually. The brakes barely worked, but they touched down, rolled out, and stopped on a taxiway while Swiss military vehicles surrounded them. Spider shut down the remaining engines and sat in the sudden silence. His hands were shaking. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. He'd just crash-landed in a neutral country, which meant he'd be interned for the rest of the war. But his crew was alive, all 10 men, not one casualty. Everyone out, he ordered, slowly, hands visible. The Swiss aren't known for their sense of humor about unauthorized landings. They climbed out of Devil's Advocate one by one, hands raised, facing a ring of Swiss soldiers with rifles. An officer approached, immaculate uniform, severe expression, the bearing of someone who took neutrality very seriously. I am Hauptmann Weber of the Swiss Air Force, he said in English. You have violated Swiss airspace and made an unauthorized landing. You and your crew are under arrest and will be interned for the duration of the war.
Understood, sir, Spider said. We appreciate your hospitality. Weber's expression softened slightly. Your aircraft is badly damaged. You're fortunate to have survived. We had help. American fighters escorted us to the border. Yes, we observed them on radar. They left their formation to protect you. Weber paused. That is unusual, tactically inefficient. That's what makes us American, Spider said. Weber considered this. Comma. We have facilities prepared for interned airmen. You'll have food, shelter, medical care. The conditions are acceptable, though you'll remain in custody until the war ends. How long do you think that'll be? Bombardier Ramirez asked. Weber looked north, toward Germany, where even now more bombers were flying more missions, dropping more bombs, grinding away at the Nazi war machine. Not long, he said quietly. The Americans and British keep coming. Every day, more bombers, more fighters, more pressure. Germany cannot sustain this. He looked back at Spider. You're winning. Slowly, expensively, but you're winning. They were processed, photographed, assigned to an internment camp near Bern. The conditions were indeed acceptable. Better than POW camps in Germany, certainly. They had food, beds, books, even recreational activities. Some interned airmen had been there for over a year, creating a small community of Americans and British who'd chosen neutral safety over German captivity. That night, Spider lay in his bunk and thought about the mission, about the choice he'd made to run for Switzerland, about the Mustang pilots who'd abandoned their formation to protect one damaged bomber, about the German fighters they'd fought off, about landing safely in a neutral country while 95 other bombers continued to Oschersleben. Had he made the right choice? Tactically, yes. His crew was alive. They'd survived. By any measure, that was success. But emotionally, it felt like failure, like he'd abandoned the mission, abandoned the other crews, abandoned the principles that made the 8th Air Force what it was. Then he remembered something his first pilot instructor had told him, back in primary training in Texas. Being a pilot means making impossible choices. You'll face situations where every option is wrong, and you have to pick the least wrong one. The measure of a good pilot isn't making perfect decisions.
It's making the best decision possible with the information you have, and then living with the consequences. Spider had made his decision. His crew was alive. 10 men would see the end of this war, would go home to families and futures and lives that hadn't been cut short over Germany. And maybe that was enough. Maybe saving 10 men mattered more than hitting one target. Maybe Brotherhood meant accepting that sometimes you can't win, can't complete the mission, can't do everything you're supposed to do, but you can protect the men beside you. The Mustang pilots had understood that. They'd sacrificed tactical positioning to protect one bomber because one bomber mattered, because 10 American lives mattered more than optimal fighter deployment. That was the American way. That was what the Germans couldn't understand. That was why, despite terrible losses and impossible odds and missions that should have broken them, American bomber crews kept flying. Not for victory, not for glory, not even for duty, but for each other. Spider closed his eyes and slept, dreaming of silver Mustangs and smoke-trailing bombers, and the long flight home that he'd never complete, but his brothers would fly for him, day after day, until the war finally ended.
Exactly. Balmer leaned back in his chair. We teach our pilots to be warriors, efficient, disciplined, tactically sound. We teach them to prioritize the mission, to accept losses as necessary costs of war. We teach them to survive and kill and win. And the Americans? The Americans teach their pilots to be brothers. Everything else, the tactics, the gunnery, the formation flying, is secondary to that central principle. They're not just fighting Germany, they're fighting for each other, and that makes them unbeatable. Hoffmann thought about his 49 confirmed kills, 49 American aircraft destroyed, roughly 400 American airmen killed, 400 men who'd believed their brothers would save them, who'd flown into German skies trusting in that bond, who'd died anyway. We've been fighting the wrong war, Hoffmann said quietly. Yes. We've been trying to defeat their tactics when we should have been trying to break their bonds. Yes, but you can't break those bonds. That's what I've realized. You can kill American airmen, destroy their aircraft, shoot down entire formations, but you can't break the belief that they fight for each other, because that belief isn't tactical, it's moral, it's who they are. The room fell silent. Outside, air raid sirens began wailing, the familiar sound that meant bombers were approaching Berlin. Again. The Americans came every day now when the weather permitted, sometimes twice a day. I interviewed a B-17 pilot last month, Balmer continued. Captain William Harrington, shot down over Hamburg. His entire crew died except him. He was the sole survivor. And do you know what he said when I asked if he felt guilty for surviving? What? He said, every day. But they'd want me to go home, to tell their families what happened, to make sure their sacrifice mattered. That's what brothers do. They carry each other's stories when they can't carry each other. Hoffmann closed his eyes. His leg throbbed. His ribs ached. His arm felt like it was on fire. But worse than the physical pain was the understanding that had been building for months, crystallizing now into absolute certainty. Germany had lost this war, not because of industrial capacity or tactical errors or strategic blunders, though all those factors mattered. Germany had lost because the Americans had brought something to the battlefield that the Wehrmacht couldn't counter. They brought love. Not romantic love. Not patriotic fervor. Just simple, powerful, unconditional love for the men beside them. The belief that every life mattered equally, that no one was expendable, that bringing your brothers home was more important than any mission objective. That philosophy had costs. The Americans took horrific casualties. Their losses over Germany were staggering. Thousands of aircraft destroyed, tens of thousands of airmen killed or captured. By any objective measure, the price they paid was too high. But they paid it anyway, because the alternative, abandoning their brothers, prioritizing efficiency over humanity, treating men as expendable resources, was unthinkable. And somehow, impossibly, that philosophy was winning the war. What happens now? Hoffmann asked.
After the war ends, after we surrender? I don't know. Balmer stood, wincing at the pain in his chest. But I think the Americans will be surprisingly generous. They'll help us rebuild. They'll create a new Germany, hopefully one that remembers what we learned too late.
March 6th, 1944. Luftwaffe Hospital, Berlin, Germany. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann lay in a hospital bed, his right leg encased in plaster from hip to ankle, his left arm in a sling, and 3 cracked ribs making every breath a lesson in controlled pain. Through the window, he could see Berlin's skyline, or what remained of it. Entire city blocks were rubble now. The RAF came at night. The Americans came by day. The city was dying by degrees. He'd been shot down 4 days ago over Brunswick. A P-51 Mustang had caught him during a disengagement, put a burst through his engine and cockpit, and sent him spinning toward Earth. He'd bailed out at 4,000 feet, landed badly in a frozen field, and spent 6 hours in the cold before Wehrmacht soldiers found him. The doctors said he'd fly again, eventually, maybe in 3 months, maybe 6. But Hoffmann knew the truth. The war would be over before he healed. The war was already over, really. Only the dying remained. The door opened. Major Karl Baumer walked in, moving carefully, favoring his left side. He'd been wounded 2 weeks ago. Shrapnel from a bomber's defensive fire had torn through his cockpit, puncturing his lung and breaking 2 ribs. They'd both survived, but they bore the marks of their survival. "You look terrible," Baumer said, pulling a chair beside Hoffmann's bed. "You look worse. How's the lung?" "Functional. Painful. The doctors say I'll be grounded for at least 2 months." Baumer sat down heavily, "Which means I'll miss the end." "The end?" "The war. The invasion. Whatever's coming." Baumer pulled out a pack of cigarettes, thought better of it, and put them away. "The Americans landed at Anzio in January. The Russians are pushing west through Ukraine. The British and Americans are massing in England for an invasion. Everyone knows it's coming, probably this summer. And we're running out of everything. Fuel, ammunition, pilots, hope." Hoffmann said nothing. What was there to say? Every pilot in the Luftwaffe knew the war was lost. They just didn't talk about it, because talking about defeat felt like betraying the men still dying. "I brought you something," Baumer said. He pulled a folder from his briefcase. "Interrogation reports from captured American airmen. Dulag Luft has been compiling them for months. I thought you'd find them interesting." "Why?" "Because you asked the right question 9 months ago. You asked why the Americans fight the way they do, why they risk everything for each other, why they refuse to abandon damaged bombers." Baumer tapped the folder. "These reports provide answers." Hoffmann took the folder and opened it. Inside were dozens of typed pages, interviews with captured B-17 and B-24 crews, P-47 and P-51 pilots, questions and answers translated into German. He started reading. Interview subject: First Lieutenant Robert Morrison, B-17 pilot, 91st Bombardment Group. Question: Why do American bomber formations stay together even when individual aircraft are damaged? Answer: Because that's what you do. You don't leave your brothers to die alone. Every man in that formation knows that if his aircraft gets hit, his squadron will stay with him as long as possible. That's the deal. That's the promise. Question: But this tactic increases casualties. Damaged aircraft slow the formation, making everyone more vulnerable. Answer: Maybe, but it also means every man flies knowing his squadron won't abandon him. That knowledge makes men brave, makes them willing to fly missions they'd never fly if they thought they were disposable. Hoffmann flipped through more pages. Interview subject: Captain James Patterson, P-51 pilot, 357th Fighter Group. Question: Why do American fighter pilots extend beyond their fuel safety margins to protect bombers? Answer: Because those bombers are full of our guys, friends, brothers. You don't measure fuel efficiency against American lives.
You stay with them as long as you possibly can, and you trust that your training and your aircraft and your luck will get you home. Question: but what if you run out of fuel over Germany? Answer: then I bail out and hope the bomber crews I protected make it home. At least then my sacrifice meant something. More pages, more interviews, more variations on the same theme. Interview subject: Staff Sergeant Anthony Rizzo, ball turret gunner. Answer: you don't understand. It's not about tactics or strategy. It's about knowing, absolutely knowing, that the guys in your crew would die for you, and you'd die for them. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing in the world. Hoffmann read for 20 minutes, absorbing report after report. The consistency was striking. Every American airman, regardless of rank or position or aircraft type, expressed the same fundamental belief. No one gets left behind. Brotherhood matters more than tactics. The mission is important, but the men are sacred. Do you understand now? Bulmer asked quietly. I'm beginning to. Hoffmann closed the folder. They've weaponized human connection, turned love and loyalty into tactical advantages. They've created a military culture where every man knows his comrades will die trying to save him. And that knowledge makes them fearless in ways our training can't replicate.
Which is that the measure of a civilization isn't how efficiently it wages war. It's how much it values individual human lives. The Americans understand that. We didn't, and that difference decided everything. Bulmer walked to the door, then paused. Klaus, when you can fly again, if the war is still going, will you? Hoffmann thought about this. Thought about climbing back into a Messerschmitt, hunting American bombers, trying to stop the inexorable tide of aircraft flowing over Germany day after day. Yes, he said finally, because even if we can't win, someone has to stand between the bombers and what's left of our country. That's what soldiers do. We fight until the end, even knowing the end is already written. The Americans would understand that. I think they would. Bulmer left, closing the door quietly. Hoffmann lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the air raid sirens, feeling the building shake as anti-aircraft guns opened fire somewhere in the city. Somewhere up there, at 25,000 feet, American bomber crews were flying in tight formation, protecting each other, refusing to leave anyone behind, fighting not for conquest or ideology or territorial gain, but for each other. And down here, in the ruins of Berlin, a German fighter pilot finally understood what made them unstoppable. It wasn't their numbers, though their numbers were overwhelming. It wasn't their technology, though their aircraft were excellent. It wasn't their tactics, though their tactics were sophisticated. It was their love. Their absolute, unwavering, unconditional love for the men beside them. That love made them brave when they should have been terrified, made them continue when they should have quit, made them risk everything for each other when logic demanded self-preservation. And that love, that simple human love, had proven stronger than all of Germany's tactical brilliance, technical innovation, and military tradition. Hoffmann had spent 4 years learning how to kill, how to be an efficient warrior, how to serve his nation through violence and discipline and duty. But he'd never learned what the Americans knew instinctively, that the strongest weapon in war isn't technology or tactics. It's the bond between brothers. It's the promise that no one fights alone. It's the absolute certainty that your comrades will die trying to save you, and that knowledge is worth dying for. The Germans had been warriors. The Americans were brothers. And in the end, brotherhood had proven stronger than war. Hoffmann closed his eyes and let the sound of distant explosions lull him towards sleep. Tomorrow the Americans would come again, and the day after, and the day after that. Until the war ended. Until Germany surrendered. Until the brothers finally went home, carrying the stories of the ones who didn't make it,
keeping faith with the promise that no one would be forgotten. That was the American way. And Hoffmann, after 4 years of fighting against it, finally understood why it had won.
May 8th, 1945. V-Day, Basingbourne Airfield, England. Colonel James Jimmy Donovan, no longer a second lieutenant, promoted twice since his capture and subsequent repatriation, stood on the tarmac watching the last B-17 land. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. After years of blood and fire and losses that sometimes seemed unbearable, it was finally finished. The bomber touched down smoothly, its tires chirping against the concrete. It taxied past the control tower, past the hangars, past the hardstands where hundreds of B-17s had once been parked. Now there were only a few dozen left, the survivors of thousands that had flown from England into German skies. The crew climbed out, and Jimmy recognized the pilot, Captain Tom Fletcher, who'd flown Memphis Belle II through the darkest days of 1943. Fletcher had completed his tour, gone home, and then, impossibly, volunteered to come back for a second tour. He'd flown another 25 missions before the war ended. "Colonel," Fletcher saluted. Jimmy returned the salute, then extended his hand. "Tom, congratulations, you made it." "We made it." Fletcher gestured at his crew, 9 men who looked exhausted, relieved, and somehow older than their years despite most being under 25. All of us, together. They walked toward the operations building, where crews were gathering to celebrate the end of the war. Someone had found champagne, God knows where, probably liberated from a French village during the advance across Europe. Music was playing. Men were laughing, shouting, embracing. But there were empty spaces in the crowd, gaps where men should have been standing. Friends who'd died over France, Germany, Austria, anywhere the bombers had flown. The 8th Air Force had lost over 26,000 men during the war. 26,000 sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. 26,000 lives sacrificed for the belief that no one fights alone. Jimmy found himself standing beside Major Karl Baumer. The German officer shouldn't have been there. Technically, he was still a prisoner of war, held at a temporary camp near London, while the Allies figured out what to do with hundreds of thousands of captured Wehrmacht personnel. But Jimmy had requested his presence, pulled strings, argued with superiors who thought it was inappropriate to invite a former enemy to a victory celebration. "This feels strange," Baumer said quietly, watching the American airmen celebrate. "Being here, among the men I fought against." "You were invited because I wanted you to understand," Jimmy replied. "Wanted you to see what we were fighting for." Baumer gestured at the celebrating crews. "I see young men who survived a terrible war, same as young German men who survived. What makes them different?" "Look closer." Baumer watched the scene more carefully. The way crews stayed together, even now. The way pilots put their arms around their gunners. The way navigators and bombardiers shared drinks and stories. The way every man in that crowd knew, absolutely knew, that the men around him had been willing to die for him. "Brotherhood," Baumer said finally. "Yes. We had that too, you know. In the Luftwaffe. Comradeship, loyalty, men who fought and died together." "You did," Jimmy agreed, "but it was different. Your brotherhood was conditional, based on duty, discipline, the demands of military hierarchy. Our brotherhood was unconditional, based on the promise that no one gets left behind, that every man matters equally, that bringing your brothers home matters more than winning efficiently." Baumer was quiet for a long moment. "That promise cost you thousands of lives, men who died trying to protect damaged aircraft, pilots who extended beyond their fuel margins, crews who stayed in formation when breaking away would have saved them." "It did. Was it worth it?" Jimmy thought about his own experience. Shot down over Germany, captured, interrogated, imprisoned at Stalag Luft III for 18 months before being liberated by advancing Allied forces. 18 months of wondering if he'd survive, if the war would end, if he'd ever see home again.
But he'd never been alone. Even in prison, surrounded by other captured airmen, he'd been part of a brotherhood that transcended the barbed wire and guard towers. They'd supported each other, protected each other, kept faith with the promise that they were all brothers, all equally valuable, all worth fighting for.
Yes,
Jimmy said, it was worth it, because we didn't just win a war. We proved that a different kind of military force was possible, one that values every individual life, one that refuses to treat men as expendable resources, one that measures victory not just by territory captured or enemies killed, but by how many brothers you bring home. Across the tarmac, someone started singing. Within seconds, dozens of voices joined in, God Bless America, off-key and enthusiastic and utterly joyful. The sound carried across the airfield, a hymn of gratitude and relief and triumph. Bomer listened, his face unreadable. What happens now? After today? After the celebrations end? We go home, Jimmy said. Back to Chicago, Brooklyn, San Francisco. Small towns across America. We try to build normal lives. We remember the ones who didn't make it. And we tell our children that war is hell, but brotherhood makes it bearable. And us? The Germans?
The promise would remain. The understanding that some things matter more than winning would remain. Fletcher joined him, carrying 2 bottles of warm beer. They stood in silence, drinking, remembering. Do you think they'll remember? Fletcher asked finally. 20 years from now, 50 years, 100. Will people remember what we did here? What we proved? Jimmy thought about the 26,000 dead, about the bomber crews who'd flown into impossible situations because their brothers needed them, about the fighter pilots who'd extended beyond their fuel margins to protect struggling bombers, about the absolute commitment to the principle that no one fights alone. I think, Jimmy said slowly, that what we proved here is bigger than any single war. We proved that military forces don't have to be brutal impersonal machines, that soldiers can be brothers first and warriors second, that the strongest armies aren't built on discipline and fear, they're built on love. The Germans will remember that? Eventually. Maybe not the ones who fought us. Their pride is too wounded, but their children, grandchildren, future generations who'll look back and wonder how they lost to an enemy they should have defeated, and they'll discover the answer. They lost because they fought for victory while we fought for each other. Fletcher finished his beer. You know what's crazy? I hated the Germans. Absolutely hated them after Billy Chen died. Wanted to kill every one of them. Wanted Germany burned to ash. And now? Now I just feel sorry for them. They fought so hard for something that wasn't worth having. Racial purity. Living space. 1,000-year Reich. All those grand ideas, and they missed the only thing that actually matters. Which is the guy next to you. Making sure he gets home. Making sure his family gets to see him again. That's it. That's the whole point of everything. They stood in silence, watching stars appear as the clouds cleared. Somewhere in Germany, Karl Baumer would return to a prisoner of war camp, begin the long process of repatriation, eventually go home to a nation divided and defeated. He'd spend the rest of his life trying to understand how Germany lost a war it should have won. The answer was simple, though it took 4 years of combat to prove it. You can't defeat men who refuse to abandon each other. You can't break formations built on brotherhood. You can't kill an ideal that values every human life equally. The Germans had been warriors, efficient, disciplined, tactically brilliant. The Americans had been brothers, inefficient sometimes, sentimental often, tactically questionable occasionally. But brotherhood had proven stronger than war. Love had proven stronger than hate. And the promise that no one fights alone had proven stronger than any military doctrine ever written. That was what the Germans had learned, too late to save themselves. That was what the Americans had known from the beginning. That was what made all the difference. You rebuild. With our help, probably. The Marshall Plan, they're calling it. American money and resources to help Europe recover. Because we learned something during this war. Defeating an enemy isn't enough. You have to help them become something better than they were. That seems naive. Maybe. But we're going to try anyway. Because that's what Americans do. We believe in second chances. In redemption. In the possibility that former enemies can become friends. Jimmy looked at Balmer. Even you, Carl. Even after everything. You're not my enemy anymore. You're just a man who fought for his country, same as I did. Balmer's eyes were wet. I killed Americans. Shot down your aircraft. Destroyed your comrades. And I ordered bombing missions that killed German civilians. Destroyed your cities. We both did terrible things because war demands terrible things. But the war is over now. Time to put down the guns and pick up the tools to rebuild. A young lieutenant approached. Couldn't have been more than 22, with a fresh-faced enthusiasm that the war hadn't completely crushed. Colonel Donovan. They're asking for you inside. General LeMay wants to say a few words to the assembled crews. I'll be right there. Jimmy turned back to Balmer. Come with me. You should hear this. I'm not sure that's... Come on. You've earned the right to hear what we learned from fighting you. They walked inside together. American colonel and German major, former enemies now walking side by side into a room full of celebrating American airmen. The crowd quieted as General Curtis LeMay stepped to the front. He was a hard man, LeMay, known for his tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency. But even he looked emotional today. Gentlemen, LeMay began, his voice carrying across the room. Today we celebrate victory. The Nazi regime has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. You've done what many thought impossible. You've defeated the most powerful military force Europe has ever seen. Cheers erupted. LeMay waited for them to subside. But I want you to remember something. This victory wasn't won by tactics or technology, though both mattered. It wasn't won by industrial capacity, though that mattered too. This victory was won by you, by men who refused to abandon each other, who flew into hell itself day after day because your brothers needed you, who understood that the mission mattered, but the men mattered more. The room was silent now, every man listening. The Germans were better trained, LeMay continued. They had better fighters, better tactics, more combat experience. By every military measure, they should have defeated us. But they didn't. Know why? Because they fought alone, and you fought together. He paused, looking around the room at faces young and old, wounded and whole, all marked by the war in ways visible and invisible. Over 26,000 American airmen died in this theater. 26,000 men who believed in the promise that no one fights alone, who trusted their brothers to protect them, who gave their lives so that others might go home. LeMay's voice thickened. We won this war because of them, because they proved that brotherhood is stronger than any weapon, that loyalty beats efficiency. Someone in the back started clapping. That love, simple human love for the men beside you, can defeat the best military force in the world. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, not for victory, but for the brothers who hadn't lived to see this day. The men who died over France, Germany, Austria, believing until their last moments that their sacrifice meant something. Jimmy looked at Balmer. The German major was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face. We didn't understand, Balmer whispered. All those reports, all those interrogations, all those questions about why you fought the way you did. We thought it was sentimentality, inefficiency. We never understood it was the source of your strength. You understand now? Yes. Too late to matter for Germany, but yes. The celebration continued into the night. Crews shared stories, toasted fallen comrades, made promises to stay in touch after they returned home. Some would keep those promises. Others would drift apart. The bonds forged in war slowly weakening as normal life resumed. But they'd always have this,
The knowledge that they'd been part of something larger than themselves, that they'd proven brotherhood could defeat hatred, that they'd shown the world a different way of fighting, one that valued every human life, refused to leave anyone behind, and measured victory by how many brothers came home. As midnight approached, Jimmy found himself back on the tarmac, staring at the silent bombers. Tomorrow they'd start the demobilization process. Crews would be rotated home. Aircraft would be decommissioned or sold or scrapped. The great armada that had darkened the skies over Germany would disperse, returning to the peaceful nation that had built it. But the lessons would remain.
June 15th, 1945. Chicago, Illinois. Jimmy Donovan stood in his parents' backyard, watching his father work the grill. The smell of cooking hamburgers mixed with summer air that tasted like freedom. His mother was inside, preparing potato salad and listening to the radio. His younger sister, Marie, was showing her friends the medals Jimmy had brought home. A Distinguished Flying Cross, an air medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, a Purple Heart. He'd been home for 3 weeks. It still didn't feel real. "You're quiet," his father said, flipping a burger. "Been quiet since you got back." "Just adjusting, Pop." To what? Being safe? Being alive? Being somewhere the sky isn't full of people trying to kill you? All of it. His father set down the spatula and looked at him. Really looked at him, the way fathers do when they're trying to see past the surface to the wounds underneath. "Your mother's worried. Says you wake up at night sometimes. Says you stand at the window watching the sky." Jimmy didn't deny it. "Sometimes I think I hear engines, bomber engines, and for a second I'm back there, over Germany, watching the formations, counting the aircraft that don't come home." How many didn't come home? Too many. They stood in silence, the hamburgers sizzling, the summer evening settling around them like a blanket. Down the street, children were playing baseball. Across the fence, the Kowalskis were having their own cookout, their son having just returned from the Pacific. Life was resuming. The war was receding into memory. But some memories wouldn't recede. "I met a lot of guys over there," Jimmy said quietly. "Pilots, navigators, gunners, bombardiers. Kids, really. Most of them younger than me. And every one of them knew they might not make it home. The statistics were brutal. You had maybe a 50-50 chance of completing your tour. Maybe. But you all flew anyway." "We flew anyway. Because." Jimmy searched for the words. "Because we weren't just individuals. We were brothers. And brothers don't let each other fly alone." His father nodded slowly. "Your mother told me about the letters you sent, about the crews that stayed together even when it was dangerous, about the fighters that protected damaged bombers, about the men who risked everything for each other. That wasn't unique to us. That was everyone. Every squadron. Every group. Every mission." Jimmy paused. The Germans never understood it. They thought we were being inefficient, sentimental, tactically unsound. They couldn't comprehend why we'd sacrifice strategic advantages for human connection. But that's what won the war. That's what made the war bearable. Maybe that's what won it too. I don't know. But I know this. I survived 18 months in a German prison camp because I wasn't alone. Other American airmen were there. We supported each other, kept each other's spirits up, refused to let anyone give up hope. That brotherhood didn't end just because we were behind barbed wire. His father pulled the hamburgers off the grill. "Come on, let's eat. Your mother made enough food to feed an entire bomber crew." They ate at the picnic table. Jimmy, his parents, his sister, and her friends. Normal conversation. Normal laughter. Normal life that felt surreal after years of war. But Jimmy's mind kept drifting back to England, to the men he'd flown with, to the crews that hadn't made it home, to the promise they'd all made, that no one would be forgotten, that every sacrifice would be remembered, that the brotherhood they'd built would outlive the war. After dinner, as the sun was setting, Jimmy walked to the corner store to buy cigarettes. On his way back,
He saw a man standing on the sidewalk, staring at a brownstone building. The man wore an Army Air Forces uniform with captain's bars. His right sleeve was pinned up. He'd lost his arm somewhere over Europe. "Evening," Jimmy said. The captain turned. He was young, maybe 25, with eyes that looked older. "Evening, Colonel." He'd spotted Jimmy's rank insignia. "Just looking at the building. Used to live there, 3rd floor before I shipped out. My buddy Pete lived next door. We enlisted together, trained together, flew together." "Where is he now?"
Regensburg, August 17th, 1943. His bomber took a direct hit from flak, went down with all crew aboard. The captain's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, the way men speak about grief they've learned to carry. "Sometimes I walk by here and think about knocking on his parents' door, telling them stories about Pete, about how brave he was, about how he died protecting his crew." "Why don't you?" "Because what do I say? Your son died on a mission where we lost 60 bombers? He's one of 600 men who didn't come home that day. He's a statistic in a war that's already over." The captain shook his head. "I don't know how to make his death matter to people who didn't fly." Jimmy understood. He'd been struggling with the same question since coming home. How do you explain to civilians what it meant to fly in formation with 95 other bombers? How do you convey the absolute trust required to stay in position while fighters attacked and flak exploded around you? How do you describe the bond between men who knew they were probably going to die but flew anyway because their brothers needed them? "You tell them the truth," Jimmy said finally. "You tell them that Pete was part of something bigger than any individual mission, that he helped prove that brotherhood can defeat hatred, that refusing to abandon each other is stronger than any weapon, that his life mattered not because he died gloriously, but because he lived honorably, protecting the men beside him until the very end." The captain was quiet for a long moment. "You think they'd understand that?" "I don't know, but we have to try, because if we don't tell these stories, if we don't preserve what we learned, then all those deaths were just statistics, numbers in a history book. But if we remember, if we keep faith with the brotherhood we built, then maybe Pete's sacrifice means something that outlasts the war." The captain nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." He extended his left hand, his remaining hand. "Captain Tom Reynolds, 381st Bomb Group." Jimmy shook it. "Colonel Jimmy Donovan, 303rd Bomb Group." "The Hells Angels. I flew with you guys on a couple missions. Your group had a reputation for never leaving anyone behind." "That was everyone, every group, every squadron." "I know, but you guys lived it. I saw your formation over Bremen once. 3 of your bombers were damaged, losing altitude, and instead of maintaining formation integrity, 5 healthy bombers dropped back to escort them. Command was screaming at you over the radio to get back in position. Your lead pilot told them, in language I can't repeat in polite company, that he wasn't abandoning his brothers." Jimmy smiled despite himself. That sounded like his squadron. "Did the damaged bombers make it?" he asked. "2 of them did. One went down over the North Sea, but the crew got picked up by air-sea rescue, all because your squadron bought them time to reach the coast." Reynolds paused. "And that's what I mean. That's the story Pete's parents need to hear. Not that their son died, but that he died for something that mattered, for men who were worth dying for." They stood on the sidewalk as evening deepened into night, 2 veterans who'd survived the war by luck and brotherhood and the grace of God. Around them, Chicago was alive with peacetime activity. Cars driving past, people walking home from work, lights coming on in apartment windows. Normal life. The life they'd fought to preserve. "You know what the Germans told me?" Reynolds said suddenly. "When I was captured, before they sent me to the hospital to deal with this," he gestured at his missing arm, "a Luftwaffe officer interviewed me. Asked me why Americans fought so stupidly, why we risked everything for damaged aircraft, why we didn't just accept losses and move on." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that we weren't fighting to minimize losses. We were fighting to maximize the value of every human life, that every man in our formation mattered,
That victory meant nothing if we achieved it by abandoning our brothers. Reynolds smiled grimly. He looked at me like I was insane, like I'd just admitted to believing in fairies or magic. He couldn't comprehend that human connection could be a tactical advantage. But it was. It was, because men who know they won't be abandoned fight harder, fly longer, endure more. The Germans were more efficient, more tactically sound, better trained. But we were brothers, and that made us unstoppable. A car drove past, its headlights washing over them. In the brief illumination, Jimmy saw tears on Reynolds' face. I miss them, Reynolds said quietly. Every day. Pete, my crew, the guys we flew with, even the ones I barely knew. I miss the clarity of purpose, the absolute certainty that what we were doing mattered, that we were fighting for each other, and that was enough. Me too. Does it get easier? Being home? Being safe? Living a normal life after everything we saw? Jimmy thought about this, about the nightmares, about standing at his window at 3 a.m, listening for bomber engines that would never come, about the guilt of survival, why him and not Bill Henderson or Billy Chen or the thousands of others who'd died. I don't know, he said honestly. But I think we owe it to them to try, to live lives worthy of their sacrifice, to remember what they taught us about brotherhood and loyalty and refusing to leave anyone behind. And to tell the stories. Yes, to tell the stories, so that future generations understand that war isn't about glory or conquest or national pride. It's about the men beside you. And if you're fighting for the right reasons, if you're fighting to protect your brothers, then even defeat can be honorable, and victory can be worth its cost. Reynolds looked back at the brownstone building. I'm going to knock on that door. Tomorrow, I'm going to tell Pete's parents about their son, about how he lived, about how he died protecting his crew, about how he mattered. They'll appreciate that. Maybe. Or maybe they'll cry and ask me why their son died for a war that's already over. But I have to try. I owe Pete that much.
We all do, Jimmy said. We all owe it to the ones who didn't make it home to keep faith with the brotherhood we built, to live lives that honor their sacrifice, to make sure their deaths weren't just statistics, but part of something larger, something that proved humanity can be better than hatred. They shook hands again, left hands, the brotherhood of survivors, and parted ways. Jimmy walked home through streets that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. This was the neighborhood he'd grown up in, the streets he'd walked 1,000 times. But he'd left as a boy and returned as a man who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, known things that couldn't be unknown. Back home, his mother was washing dishes, his father was reading the newspaper, his sister was on the phone with a friend, giggling about something that seemed impossibly trivial compared to life and death over Germany. But that triviality was what they'd fought for, the right to giggle about insignificant things, the luxury of normal problems, the freedom to live without fear that the sky would rain fire and death. "You okay, honey?" his mother asked, drying her hands. "Yeah, Ma, I'm okay." "You sure? You've been awful quiet." Jimmy pulled her into a hug. "I'm sure, just remembering, thinking, trying to figure out how to live in a world where no one's shooting at me." She held him tight. "You'll figure it out. Give it time." Time. Maybe that was all it would take. Time to process. Time to heal. Time to integrate the lessons of war into the rhythms of peace. But some lessons he never wanted to forget. The lesson that every human life has infinite value. The lesson that brotherhood is stronger than any weapon. The lesson that refusing to abandon each other, even when abandonment would be tactically sound, is what separates civilization from barbarism. The Germans had learned those lessons too late. The Americans had known them all along. And that difference had decided the war. Jimmy went to bed that night, and for the first time since coming home, slept without nightmares. He dreamed instead of bomber formations flying through clear skies, their contrails drawing white lines against perfect blue.
damaged bombers surrounded by healthy ones, fighter escorts staying with struggling aircraft, crews protecting each other with absolute commitment. Brotherhood made visible in aluminium and exhaust. Love made tactical. Humanity weaponized against hatred. When he woke, the sun was streaming through his window and birds were singing. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, sounds of a world that American airmen had fought to preserve. He got up and stood at the window, looking east toward the sunrise. Somewhere over there, across the Atlantic, across Europe, Karl Baumer was probably doing the same thing, standing at a window, watching the sun rise over a defeated Germany, trying to understand how they'd lost a war they should have won. The answer was simple, even if it had taken hundreds of thousands of lives to prove it. You can't defeat men who refuse to abandon each other. You can't break bonds forged in shared sacrifice. You can't kill an ideal that says every life matters equally. That was what the Americans had brought to the war. That was what the Germans had learned too late. That was what would outlive all the tactics, all the technology, all the battles and campaigns and strategic decisions. The Brotherhood remained. The promise remained. The understanding that no one fights alone remained. And would remain as long as there were men willing to remember. As long as there were stories to tell. As long as there were sons to teach about fathers who died protecting each other. Jimmy Donovan made a promise that morning, standing at his window, watching the sun rise over Chicago. He'd remember. He'd tell the stories. He'd keep faith with the Brotherhood that had sustained him through the darkest days of war. And he'd make sure that future generations understood. Victory isn't just about winning. It's about how you win. And why you fight. And who you fight for. And the Americans had won because they fought for each other. That was the lesson of World War II. That was the legacy of the men who died over Germany. That was the promise that would outlive them all.
September 2nd, 1985. Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. Colonel James Donovan, retired now for 15 years, stood at a podium in front of 200 Air Force Academy cadets. At 73 years old, he moved slower than he used to, his right leg still bearing the scars from that bailout over Germany 42 years ago. But his voice was steady, his mind sharp, and his memory of those days remained crystalline. This was the part of retirement he'd agreed to, speaking at military academies, sharing the lessons learned in the skies over Europe, ensuring that the next generation understood what his generation had paid to learn. "Gentlemen and ladies," he began, still strange, that women at the Air Force Academy, but times changed, and Jimmy had learned to change with them. "I've been asked to speak to you today about tactical formation flying, defensive gunnery, and bomber operations during World War II. But I'm not going to do that. You can read about tactics in books." The cadets leaned forward, notebooks ready. "What I'm here to tell you can't be found in any manual." They were so young, 18, 19, 20 years old. The same age Jimmy had been when he first climbed into a B-17 and learned what it meant to fly into hell. "I'm going to tell you about something that decided World War II more than any weapon or tactic," Jimmy continued. "Something that's still deciding wars today, though we don't always recognize it. I'm going to tell you about Brotherhood, about the promise that no one fights alone, about why that promise is the most powerful weapon any military force can possess." He paused, letting the words settle. "In 1943, I was shot down over Germany. My entire crew died except me. I bailed out at 3,000 feet, was captured, and spent 18 months in a prison camp. During those 18 months, I had a lot of time to think, to wonder if what we were doing, this philosophy of never leaving anyone behind, was actually helping us win or just getting more men killed." A hand went up. Jimmy nodded. "Sir,
The statistics show that American bomber formations that broke apart to protect damaged aircraft had higher overall casualties than formations that maintained integrity. Wasn't the German criticism valid? That you were being tactically unsound?
Yes,
Jimmy said simply. By pure numbers, they were right. Formations that scattered to protect damaged bombers did suffer higher casualties. But here's what the Germans never understood. Morale isn't a statistic. Courage isn't a number on a spreadsheet. And the knowledge that your comrades will die trying to save you creates a willingness to face danger that no amount of training can replicate. He walked from behind the podium, moving closer to the cadets. Let me tell you about a mission. August 17th, 1943. Regensburg, Schweinfurt. We lost 60 bombers that day, 600 men dead or captured. By any measure, it was a disaster. But do you know what I remember most about that mission? The cadets were silent. I remember watching a B-17 called Lucky Strike get hit. 2 engines on fire. Controls failing. The pilot, Captain Wilson, radioed that they were done. Couldn't make it home. Crew was going to bail out over Germany. And do you know what happened? Jimmy's voice grew thick with emotion, even after all these years. 2 other bombers, one damaged, one healthy, dropped out of formation to protect them, stayed with Lucky Strike while the crew bailed out, fought off German fighters to give those men time to escape a dying aircraft. The healthy bomber had no tactical reason to be there. By every military principle, Captain Garrett should have stayed with the formation, but he didn't, because 7 American airmen needed protection, and he wasn't going to let them face death alone. A female cadet raised her hand. Sir, did they make it? The crew from Lucky Strike? 7 out of 10 survived, became prisoners of war, went home to their families after the war ended. Jimmy smiled. One of them, Staff Sergeant Peter Morrison, became a teacher, taught high school history for 35 years, had 4 kids, 12 grandkids, lived a full life because Captain Garrett decided that protecting 7 men mattered more than optimal tactical positioning. He let that sink in. Now, here's the question I want you to think about. What would have happened if we hadn't protected each other? If we'd told bomber crews that damaged aircraft were on their own, that everyone had to prioritize their own survival, that brotherhood was secondary to efficiency? Another hand. Sir, theoretically, casualties would have been lower. Each aircraft operating independently would have better survival odds than formations that split to protect damaged members. Maybe, Jimmy acknowledged, in the short term. But what happens to morale when crews know they'll be abandoned if they're hit? What happens to willingness to take risks when you know you're expendable? What happens to unit cohesion when survival is individual rather than collective? He walked back to the podium.
The Germans were brilliant tacticians. Their pilots were superbly trained. Their aircraft were often superior to ours. They should have defeated us. By every calculation, they had the advantage. But they lost. And they lost in part because they fought alone while we fought together. A cadet in the back row stood. Sir, permission to ask a difficult question? Granted. Isn't this just sentimentality? Dressing up tactical inefficiency in emotional language? Modern warfare is about precision, technology, overwhelming force applied efficiently. Does brotherhood really matter when we can win through superior firepower? Jimmy smiled. He'd been waiting for that question. What's your name, Cadet? Cadet Second Class Jennifer Martinez, sir. Cadet Martinez, let me answer your question with another question. If you're flying a mission and your aircraft is damaged, you're losing altitude, you're alone over enemy territory. Would you rather fly in an air force that's been taught to prioritize efficiency, or one that's been taught that no one gets left behind? Martinez thought about this. With respect, sir, I'd rather fly in an air force so efficient that I don't get shot down in the first place. Laughter rippled through the auditorium. Jimmy laughed too. Fair point. But war doesn't work that way. No matter how efficient you are, people get hurt. Aircraft get damaged. Things go wrong. And in those moments, those terrible moments when you're alone and scared and wondering if you're going to die,
The difference between an efficient military and a Brotherhood military becomes very clear. He pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was yellowed with age, the creases worn from decades of folding and unfolding. This is a letter from Major Karl Barmer. He was a German fighter pilot I met after the war. We became friends, believe it or not. Corresponded for 40 years until he died last year. In his final letter, he wrote something I want to share with you. Jimmy unfolded the letter carefully and read. Klaus and I spent 4 years fighting the Americans. We shot down hundreds of their bombers, killed thousands of their airmen. By military statistics, we were successful, but we never broke them, never made them stop coming, never defeated their will to fight. After the war, I spent decades trying to understand why. The answer, I finally realized, was simple. The Americans weren't fighting for territory or ideology or national glory. They were fighting for each other. And men who fight for their brothers cannot be defeated by men who fight for abstract concepts. This was Germany's great failure. Not tactical, not strategic, but philosophical. We never understood that love is stronger than hate, that brotherhood defeats isolation, that the promise to never leave anyone behind creates soldiers who cannot be broken. The Americans understood this instinctively. We learned it too late. The auditorium was silent. Jimmy folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. Karl Barmer was one of the finest pilots Germany ever produced. 49 confirmed kills. Knight's Cross with oak leaves. He survived the war and lived to be 78 years old. And he spent the last 40 years of his life trying to understand how Germany lost a war they should have won. That letter is his answer. A hand went up near the front. Sir, how do we apply this to modern warfare? We use drones now. Precision strikes. Technology that keeps pilots at a distance. How does Brotherhood apply when warfare is becoming increasingly impersonal? That's the critical question, Jimmy said, because modern warfare is seductive. It promises clean kills, minimal casualties, victory without sacrifice. But war is never clean. People still die. And when they do, the question becomes, have we built a military culture that values those people as individuals, or have we created a system that treats them as expendable resources? He gestured at the cadets. You're the ones who will answer that question. You're the ones who will lead the next generation of airmen and soldiers and sailors. And the choices you make, whether to prioritize efficiency or brotherhood, whether to measure success by missions completed or people brought home, those choices will determine what kind of military we have, what kind of nation we are. Another cadet stood. Sir, isn't there a balance? Can't we be both efficient and brotherly? Absolutely, and that's the goal. But when those values conflict, when you have to choose between completing a mission and saving a comrade, that's when your true priorities become clear. During World War II, we chose comrades. Not always, not perfectly, but consistently enough that the Germans noticed. Consistently enough that it became part of our identity. Consistently enough that it helped us win. Jimmy checked his watch. He'd been speaking for 45 minutes. Time was almost up. Let me leave you with this, he said. In 1943, I flew with a crew of 9 men. Bill Henderson, Mickey Reardon, Tommy Chen, and 6 others whose names I say every night before I sleep. They all died when our bomber was shot down. For 42 years, I've carried the guilt of surviving when they didn't. And for 42 years, I've tried to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. His voice broke slightly. They didn't die for tactics or strategy or military efficiency. They died protecting each other, fighting for each other, refusing to abandon each other even when abandonment would have been logical. That's what American airmen did. That's what American military forces should always do. Not because it's efficient, though sometimes it is. Not because it guarantees victory, though often it helps, but because it's right. Because every human life has infinite value. Because no one should fight alone. Because brotherhood is what separates us from our enemies. He stepped back from the podium. You're dismissed. But before you go, I want you to think about this. Who are you fighting for?
If the answer is anything other than the person beside me, you need to reconsider why you're wearing that uniform. The cadets stood and applauded. Jimmy accepted it with a nod, then made his way off the stage. His leg hurt. It always hurt after standing too long. But it was a good hurt, a reminder that he'd survived, that he had a story to tell, that the brotherhood he'd known over Germany 42 years ago still mattered today. A young cadet approached as he was leaving. Cadet Martinez, the one who'd asked about sentimentality versus efficiency. "Sir, can I ask you something else?" "Of course." "Do you really believe Brotherhood can still work in modern warfare, with all the technology and distance and complexity?"
Jimmy smiled. "Cadet, I believe Brotherhood is the only thing that will ever make warfare bearable. Technology changes. Tactics evolve. Enemies come and go. But the human need for connection, for loyalty, for the certainty that someone has your back, that never changes. If we lose that, if we become so efficient that we forget to be human, then we've lost something more important than any war." Martinez nodded slowly. "I think I understand, sir." You will. When you're flying your first combat mission and things go wrong and you're scared and wondering if you'll make it home, that's when you'll understand. And I hope, when that moment comes, you'll have brothers beside you who refuse to let you face it alone. Thank you, sir. Jimmy watched her walk away, then made his way to the parking lot where his wife was waiting. Mary had been patient for 42 years, listening to his stories, supporting him through the nightmares and guilt and endless processing of trauma that never quite healed. "How'd it go?" she asked as he climbed into the car. "Good. I think they heard me." "You always think they didn't hear you. Then you get letters from them 10 years later saying your speech changed their lives." She was right. Jimmy had received hundreds of letters over the years from officers who'd heard him speak as cadets, telling him how his words had influenced their leadership, their decisions, their understanding of what military service meant. But he never felt like he'd said it right. Never felt like he'd fully conveyed what it meant to fly in formation with 95 other bombers, all committed to protecting each other. Never felt like he'd adequately honored the men who died believing their brothers wouldn't abandon them. "Do you think it mattered?" he asked quietly. "Everything we did, everything we lost. Do you think it made a difference?" Mary reached over and took his hand. "Jimmy, you helped defeat Nazi Germany. You proved that democracy could survive against fascism. You showed the world that brotherhood defeats hatred. Of course it mattered." But was it worth the cost? 26,000 dead American airmen. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians killed in the bombing. Cities destroyed. Lives ruined. Was brotherhood worth that price? "I don't know," Mary said honestly. "But I know this. You fought for the right reasons. You protected your brothers. You refused to abandon anyone. And that mattered more than any single mission or tactical decision. That's what your crew died for. That's what you survived to remember. And that's worth preserving." Jimmy nodded and stared out the window as they drove home. The Alabama landscape was green and peaceful. No contrails in the sky. No bombers. No fighters. Just a normal September afternoon in a world that American airmen had fought to preserve. That night, like every night, Jimmy said the names before he slept. Bill Henderson, Mickey Reardon, Tommy Chen, all 9 crew members, remembered individually, honored specifically, never forgotten. That was the promise. That was the legacy. That was what brotherhood meant, remembering the names, telling the stories, keeping faith with the men who didn't come home. And as Jimmy drifted towards sleep, he thought about Karl Balmer's letter, about the German pilot who'd spent 40 years trying to understand why his superior tactics hadn't defeated American sentimentality. The answer was simple, even if it had taken millions of lives to prove. Love is stronger than hate. Brotherhood defeats isolation. The promise that no one fights alone creates armies that cannot be broken. That was what the Germans learned too late.
That was what the Americans knew from the beginning. That was what Jimmy Donovan had spent 42 years trying to teach the next generation. Tomorrow, he'd wake up and do it again. Give another speech, tell another story. Say the names. Keep the promise. Because that's what survivors do. They remember. They honor. They ensure that the sacrifices of the dead continue to teach the living. Until the last veteran dies. Until the last story is told. Until the last name is spoken. The Brotherhood remains.